For most of human existence, hunger was not a crisis. It was the background condition of life. A person could spend hours searching the landscape and still return with little to eat. A season of effort could pass before a field finally produced food. The human body that exists today, our ability to store fat, our strong response to sweetness, even the quiet patience of our metabolism was shaped in a world where meals were uncertain and long stretches between food were common. In many ways, the biology we carry today was built in partnership with scarcity. Yet the modern world surrounds us with constant food, constant abundance, and constant choice. If the human body was shaped by a past where hunger was normal, what does that reveal about our species and why were humans hungry for most of history? For most of human history, hunger began long before famine. It began in the ordinary shape of the world itself. The landscapes in which human beings first emerged were not arranged for comfort, and certainly not arranged for regular meals. Food existed, but it did not wait in one place, and it did not appear in equal measure from day to day. In one season, a grassland could seem full of life, with edible plants, insects, eggs, and the movement of grazing animals across open ground. In another season, the same place could turn sparse, dry, and uncertain, offering far less than memory might promise. Early humans did not step into a world of steady provision. They stepped into a shifting mosaic of opportunities, and that meant that the absence of food was never an exception. It was one of the basic conditions of being alive. This is important because the question is not simply why some ancient people starved in rare disasters. The deeper question is why so many humans, across so much time, lived so close to the edge of hunger even when they were healthy, skilled, and adapted to their surroundings. Part of the answer begins with ecology. Wild landscapes usually produce food in scattered forms. Edible roots must be found and dug. Fruit appears briefly and then vanishes. Herd animals move. Small prey escapes. Honey is rich but difficult and risky to collect. Seeds may be abundant, but often only for a short period, and they may require labor before they can be eaten. Even near rivers, coasts, forests, or wetlands, abundance was rarely simple. It was seasonal, local, and uneven. A place that looks generous from a distance may support life only through constant motion, careful knowledge, and repeated effort. This matters because human origins were shaped inside that kind of environment. Our species did not begin in granaries, markets, or fields of stored grain. It began among foragers, among moving groups, among people whose survival depended on reading weather, plants, animal tracks, and timing. The body and mind of early humans were formed under the pressure of uncertainty, not the promise of regular supply. Hunger in that setting was not always dramatic. Often it was quieter than that. It could mean a day of gathering that brought back less than hoped. It could mean dividing a small amount among many people. It could mean eating foods that were safe, but not especially rich in calories. It could mean knowing where food should be, arriving there, and finding that the season had shifted, the animals had passed, or other groups had already used the area. None of this requires imagining constant collapse. It only requires understanding that reliable surplus was rare. The natural world can support human life, but it often does so unevenly, and uneven support produces recurring strain. That strain helps explain why hunger accompanied human life across such a long span of time. It also helps explain why food was never just food. It was time, distance, weather, risk, memory, cooperation, and luck gathered into one daily problem. When we look back toward the beginning of human life, we are not looking at people who failed to solve hunger once and for all. We are looking at people who lived in a world where the problem could never be solved permanently, only managed from place to place and season to season. Before agriculture, before storage on a large scale, before transport, and long before modern abundance, human beings were tied closely to the immediate landscape. And the immediate landscape, however beautiful or alive it may have been, did not feed people evenly. That may be the first quiet reason humans were hungry for most of history. The world that made us was rich enough to keep us alive, but rarely stable enough to let us forget hunger for very long. A world without reliable food does not only shape what people eat, it shapes how they move, how far they travel, how closely they watch the sky, and how carefully they remember the land. In the deep human past, Survival depended less on finding a single great source of food than on piecing together many small sources across time. A patch of roots might help for a few days. A tree with seasonal fruit might briefly become important. Shellfish along a shore, eggs from a nest, insects gathered from bark or soil, and small animals caught with patience could all contribute to survival. But none of these guaranteed ease. What matters here is not that ancient humans lived in constant catastrophe. It is that the search for energy was repetitive, uncertain, and often inefficient by modern standards. Calories were gained through knowledge and labour, and sometimes the labour cost was high compared with the reward. This is one reason hunger could remain close, even when people were highly skilled. Human origins help explain why this mattered so much. Early members of our lineage did not evolve in one simple environment that offered the same resources every week of the year. They lived through changing climates and shifting habitats, especially across Africa, where woodland, grassland, river corridors, lake margins, and more open country could all become important in different times and places. In such settings, food was not absent, but it was patchy. A landscape could contain life without offering steady nourishment at every moment. To survive there, humans needed flexibility. They needed broad diets, sharp memory, cooperation, and the ability to move when local resources became thin. That flexibility was an achievement, but it was also a sign of pressure. A species that must stay flexible is often living with uncertainty. Hunger grows easily in uncertainty, not only through complete lack, but through inconsistency. The body notices inconsistency. A person may eat enough on one day and less on the next. One stretch of land may support a group for a short time, then fail to do so. Weather can change the flowering of plants, the movement of animals, and the availability of water, all of which affect access to food. Even success could be temporary. A rich place might attract more people or be used up quickly. A carcass found by chance might provide important nourishment, but only once. A cluster of edible plants might matter for a week and then disappear from the daily route. This constant variation created a world in which food had to be pursued rather than expected. That distinction is central to understanding the human past. Modern people often experience food as something stored, displayed, and ready. Early humans usually experienced it as something hidden in the landscape, delayed by effort, or interrupted by conditions beyond their control. This does not mean all ancient diets were poor in every place. Some habitats were clearly more productive than others, and certain coasts, lakes, wetlands, and river valleys could support relatively rich foraging. But even rich habitats were not always stable through time. Water levels changed. Seasonal cycles shifted. Animal populations moved. Storms, drought, and cold periods altered what could be found. The broader pattern remains. The world that formed human life was not organized around dependable daily surplus. It was organized around variable returns. That is why hunger should be understood not only as an event, but as a pressure woven into ordinary existence. Long before states, markets, or fields of grain, the human day was already structured by searching, waiting, carrying, processing, sharing, and hoping that the landscape would give enough once again. When we return to the beginning of the human story, we find a species learning to survive within a living world that was never empty, but rarely generous in a stable way. That quiet instability may have been one of the oldest forces shaping human life, and one of the reasons hunger followed our species for so much of its history. To live in a world of uncertain food is to live by timing as much as by strength. The earth does not offer its calories all at once, and it does not offer them to every place in the same way. A human group moving through open land, woodland edge, or river country would have faced not simply the question of where food existed, but when it could be reached in usable form. Plants must ripen before they nourish. Tubers must be found in the right ground and at the right season. Animals follow water, shade, migration routes, breeding cycles, and their own food sources. Fish may become easier to catch at one moment and harder at another. Even insects, eggs, nuts, and shellfish depend on timing, weather, and local conditions. This means that the hunger of early humans was tied not only to scarcity, but to delay. Food might exist nearby in a biological sense and still remain unavailable in a practical sense. That difference matters. It means a landscape could be alive and yet still leave people waiting. This is one of the quiet lessons of human origins. Our species emerged not in a controlled environment, but in a moving system of seasons, temperatures, water shifts, and ecological rhythms that had no concern for human need. To survive there, people needed more than appetite. They needed memory of place, patience, social sharing, and the ability to endure gaps between better moments. Hunger, in this deeper sense, was not only about emptiness in the stomach, it was about living inside a calendar written by the natural world. This helps explain why the problem lasted so long. Before farms, long-term storage, and large transport networks, most food had to be found close to the moment it was eaten. There was little room between the environment and the body. If a week went badly, the body felt it. If a familiar source failed, the group had to adapt immediately. The distance between ecology and metabolism was very small. Modern abundance hides that relationship, but in the beginning of human life it was direct and unavoidable. A delayed harvest of wild grains, a missing herd, a dry stream, or a poor run of fish did not remain outside the human story as background scenery. It entered the body as fatigue, thinner reserves, and caution around the next day. This is also why hunger cannot be explained only by saying ancient humans lacked technology. Knowledge mattered enormously, and so did cooperation, but neither could make wild environments fully predictable. A skilled group might know dozens of food sources and still face lean periods because each source had limits of season, distance, labor, and chance. The human species became remarkably adaptable, partly because it had to survive these limits again and again. Our origins, therefore, do not point to a lost age of easy foraging. They point to a long apprenticeship in uncertainty. People learned to read landscapes with extraordinary care because landscapes did not feed them automatically. They learned to move because staying still could be dangerous. They learned to share because no one person could guarantee success every day. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, the answer begins here, before kingdoms, before fields, before written records. It begins in a world where food was real but irregular, visible but not always reachable, and abundant in one moment only to fade in the next. Hunger endured for so long because the earliest human environment did not fail completely. It did something more demanding than that. It offered just enough to sustain life, while rarely offering enough certainty to free humans from the need to search, wait, and begin again. Finding food in the human past was rarely a single act. It was usually a chain of acts, each one uncertain, each one small, and each one vulnerable to failure. A person might begin the day not by moving toward a guaranteed source of nourishment, but by moving toward possibility. Possibility could mean a stand of plants remembered from an earlier season, a patch of ground where roots had once been found, a shoreline where shellfish could sometimes be gathered, or an animal trail that suggested movement nearby. None of these were promises. They were clues. This is an important shift in perspective, because modern people often imagine ancient food gathering as if it were a simpler version of shopping or harvesting, just with rougher tools. In reality, early humans usually worked inside a far more fragile system. They collected what the land happened to make available, and what it made available changed constantly. Gathering, hunting, scavenging, trapping, digging, climbing, cracking, cutting, pounding, and carrying were all part of the long effort of turning a living landscape into usable energy. Human origins matter here because the earliest members of our species and their close ancestors did not begin with one specialized diet that solved the problem neatly. They were flexible omnivores. That flexibility helped them survive, but it also reveals the pressure they lived under. A body that can eat many things is often a body adapted to uncertainty. Plants could provide important calories, but many edible plants were fibrous, seasonal, or difficult to process. Tubers had to be located underground. Seeds often had to be gathered in quantity and then cleaned or crushed. Nuts could be rich in fat, yet hard shells and short seasons limited easy access. Honey was valuable but difficult to reach. Meat could provide dense nourishment, but obtaining it was never simple. Large hunting was risky and not always successful. Smaller animals might be easier to catch in some places, but they offered less energy and still required time and skill. Scavenging from carcasses may sometimes have mattered too, though opportunities like that were irregular and often contested by other animals. Even where coasts, rivers, or wetlands provided fish and shellfish, people still needed timing, local knowledge, and repeated labor. The pattern is clear even if the details differ from place to place. Early humans did not rely on one steady stream of food. They assembled meals from many partial sources, and each source could fail in its own way. This patchwork way of eating helps explain why hunger remains so near. A day could contain a great deal of effort without producing a great deal of food. Distance itself was part of the cost. Food was not always where people slept, and water, shelter, and safety also shaped movement. The landscape had to be read as a whole. A place rich in one resource could be poor in another. A route that led toward plants might lead away from animal movement. A successful search could also create more work afterward, because some foods required processing before they could be eaten safely or digested well. In this sense, the food economy of early humans was not just uncertain, it was labor-intensive from beginning to end. That is why the human story begins not with regular meals, but with repeated problem-solving. People survived by learning hundreds of details about terrain, season, smell, texture, and timing. Yet all that intelligence did not remove hunger from daily life. It only helped hold hunger at manageable levels. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, one part of the answer lies in this ordinary rhythm of foraging itself. Food had to be searched for in fragments, and the body had to live on whatever those fragments, taken together, could provide. What early humans found in the landscape was not always ready to become food. Many things that were technically edible still demanded time, judgment, and work before they could sustain the body. This is easy to forget in a world where most meals arrive already sorted, cleaned, and softened by other hands. In the older human past, the path from discovery to nourishment was often long. A root had to be dug from the ground, stripped, cleaned, and sometimes cooked. Hard seeds had to be collected in large numbers before they became worthwhile, then winnowed, crushed, or ground. Nuts had to be cracked. Fibrous plants had to be chewed or processed. Animal bodies had to be cut apart, shared, and used quickly before decay or scavengers made them less useful. Even along shorelines or river edges, where food could at times seem plentiful, gathering shellfish or catching fish still required movement, timing, and repeated effort. This means that the search for food was only the first layer of the problem. The second layer was conversion. Humans had to turn scattered biological material into usable calories, and that conversion consumed energy of its own. This connects directly to human origins, because our species emerged with hands capable of manipulation, minds suited to pattern recognition, and social lives built partly around cooperation. Those traits were not luxuries. They were deeply useful in a world where nourishment often depended on processing. The body was not simply handed food by the environment, it had to extract it. In that sense, hunger persisted not only because resources were unevenly distributed, but because many resources existed behind barriers of labor. A landscape could hold plants, animals, and hidden calories without offering immediate relief. What the human body needed was not just edible matter somewhere nearby, but net energy after the effort of obtaining and preparing it. That distinction is central. A person may spend much of a day pursuing food and still end the day with only modest gain. Over time, modest gain can keep a group alive, but it does not remove the background pressure of insufficiency. This is one reason broad dietary flexibility did not create abundance by itself. Flexibility allowed survival under many conditions, yet it also meant that ancient humans often relied on fallback foods, resources that were dependable enough to matter but not rich enough to erase hunger. Such foods may have filled the stomach without fully ending the day's nutritional strain. They were signs of resilience, but also signs of constraint. Early human life, therefore, involved a constant negotiation between effort and return. One route might offer a chance of animal protein, but with high risk of failure. Another might offer roots or seeds that were more reliable but slow to gather and prepare. A shoreline might be productive at 1 hour, and less so at another. The day was shaped by these calculations, whether explicit or deeply habitual. Knowledge of the land helped, but knowledge could not make calories appear where the season had reduced them, or where previous gathering had already thinned them. That is why the beginning of the human story is not best imagined as a time of simple natural abundance. It is better understood as a time when people survived through patient extraction from difficult environments. They dug, cracked, cut, carried, and waited. They turned overlooked materials into life. Yet the very need for such labour shows how narrow the margin often was. Hunger stayed close because food was not merely found. It had to be transformed, and every transformation took time from bodies that were already spending energy to remain alive in the first place. The way early humans ate was shaped not only by what they could find, but by what they could afford to keep ignoring. No group could spend all of its time chasing the richest possible food. Much of life had to be built around resources that were ordinary, repetitive, and sometimes disappointing, because ordinary resources were often the only ones available often enough to matter. This is one of the quieter reasons humans remained hungry for so much of history. The landscape did not usually offer a perfect match between what the body most wanted and what the day could reliably provide. Rich animal fat, sweet fruit, or dense stores of starch could be deeply valuable, but they were not always present in sufficient quantity. More often, people had to depend on a wide range of lesser returns, foods that were useful because they prevented complete failure, not because they created lasting abundance. Human origins help explain why this pattern mattered so deeply. Our species emerged as a generalist, capable of using many habitats and many food types, but that generalism should not be mistaken for ease. It meant that survival often depended on accepting whatever the environment yielded at a given moment. In one stretch of time, that might mean roots, seeds, or fibrous plant foods gathered with patience. In another, it might mean shellfish, insects, eggs, or small animals that offered modest energy but required repeated effort. Large game could transform the food situation for a while, yet such success was uncertain and probably uneven. This is why many anthropologists distinguish between preferred foods and fallback foods. Preferred foods may provide more energy or taste better, but fallback foods often carry people through the ordinary gaps of life. The existence of fallback foods is itself a sign that hunger sits nearby. A species that relies on backup nourishment is a species living with unpredictability. This does not mean ancient humans were always on the edge of collapse. It means the structure of daily life was organized around preventing shortfall rather than enjoying constant surplus. That difference is essential. The body feels it over time. A person who repeatedly lives on foods that are available rather than ideal is still surviving. Yet survival under that condition keeps the memory of scarcity active in the body and in social behavior. It also shapes the use of time. If gathering enough calories requires many hours of movement, search, processing, and transport, then the margin for comfort remains small. A good day may simply repair the weakness of a bad one. A modest success may need to be shared across many people. A rich source may not last long. When we place this beside the beginning of human history, a clearer picture emerges. Early humans were not simply hunting heroes or carefree gatherers wandering through natural abundance. They were practical energy managers living in landscapes that offered scattered returns. Their skill lay in combining incomplete resources into a workable diet, and that very skill reveals the pressure they faced. The world that formed human life rewarded flexibility because certainty was rare. It rewarded memory because resources appeared and disappeared. It rewarded cooperation because one person's failure could be softened by another person's success. Yet even cooperation did not cancel the basic truth that calories entered human life irregularly. This is why the human past was so often touched by hunger without always descending into famine. Famine is a sharp rupture. Hunger, by contrast, can be a low and continuing condition, a narrowness in the flow of energy between land and body. Early humans learned to live inside that narrowness. They developed ways to endure it, soften it, and occasionally overcome it for a time. But the need to rely so often on partial, ordinary fallback foods shows that for much of history, the question was not how to live in abundance. It was how to remain alive in a world where enough food was usually possible, but rarely guaranteed for long. Large animals have a powerful place in the modern imagination of prehistory. They seem to promise decisive meals, dramatic success, and a clear answer to the problem of hunger. Yet the deeper human story is quieter and less certain than that image suggests. Hunting could bring dense nourishment, but it could also bring long stretches of failure, delay, and effort that ended with very little. This matters because meat, especially from larger animals, was never simply a matter of desire. It was a matter of chance. Landscape, cooperation, skill, and timing all meeting at the same moment. When those things did not align, the body still had to continue through the day. This is one reason hunger remained close, even in societies that knew how to hunt well. Human origins help place this in perspective. Early humans evolved in environments where animal life was present, but not arranged for easy capture. Wild animals move, flee, hide, defend themselves, and change their patterns with weather, water, season, and human pressure. A herd seen one day may be gone the next. Tracks may lead nowhere useful. Small prey may cost more effort than the meat is worth. Larger prey may require many people, careful coordination, and a degree of luck that cannot be commanded. Even when hunting knowledge was deep and tools were effective for their time, success was never guaranteed. That uncertainty means that the presence of animals in a landscape should not be confused with reliable access to animal food. The body lives not on what exists in theory, but on what can actually be obtained. This is where the long gaps begin to matter. A hunting society does not necessarily eat meat every day, simply because hunting is central to its way of life. The search itself can occupy much of the rhythm of living. People may walk long distances, watch for signs, wait in silence, track movement, lose trails, abandon chases, or return with little. A successful hunt can provide important nourishment, and may be remembered for a long time, but memory can distort frequency. One large return stands out precisely because it interrupts a more ordinary pattern of uncertainty. Between those moments lie many smaller days, the days when energy must be found elsewhere or stretched carefully across time. This does not mean prehistoric hunting was ineffective. It means it operated within ecological limits. The beginning of human life was shaped not by constant triumph over those limits, but by repeated negotiation with them. Endurance became as important as skill. People needed to remain capable through unsuccessful days, not only during successful ones. That pressure likely helped favor cooperation, food sharing, and flexible diets. It also helps explain why hunger could be present without complete starvation. A group might remain functional while still living with recurring shortfalls, modest meals, and long anticipation of better returns. Meat, in that setting, was valuable partly because it was uncertain. The uncertainty itself increased its importance. Archaeological evidence can show that animals were used, hunted, and processed, but it rarely supports the idea of uninterrupted plenty. Bones with cut marks, hunting tools, and animal remains tell us that meat mattered. They do not erase the long spaces between those moments. Ethnographic comparisons with more recent foraging peoples, while never perfect windows into deep prehistory, also suggest that hunting success can be irregular, and that subsistence often depends on combining hunting with many other sources of food. The broader pattern remains careful and consistent. Hunting could enrich the diet, sometimes dramatically, but it did not free humans from the older condition of uncertainty. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, the answer is not that they failed to hunt. It is that even successful hunters lived in a world where success arrived unevenly. The animal might exist, the knowledge might exist, the need might be urgent, and still the day could end with no kill. In that long distance between pursuit and capture, hunger remained one of the most ordinary companions of human life. A successful hunt could change the mood of a group for a time, but it could not change the structure of the world. The world remained one in which animals moved according to their own needs, not human hunger. This is why the space between hunts matters so much. Those intervals were not empty moments in the story. They were the normal background against which human life unfolded. A group might know a region well, understand its trails, remember where water collected, and still fail to meet an animal at the right time and in the right conditions. Wind could carry scent in the wrong direction. Heat could alter movement. Rain could erase signs. Herds could pass beyond reach. A wounded animal could escape into difficult ground. Smaller prey could be seen and then lost. None of this means people lacked knowledge. It means knowledge had to operate inside an ecological system that was never designed to be dependable from a human point of view. This is one of the most important links to the beginning of our species. Human beings emerged in landscapes where energy was often stored in mobile bodies. Plant foods could be rooted in place, but animal calories could walk away. That simple fact shaped the daily experience of hunger in a very deep way. It meant that some of the richest nourishment in the environment existed at a distance, even when it was physically nearby. A hunter could see the source of food and still not possess it. This gap between visibility and possession likely mattered enormously for the development of patience, tracking skill, cooperation, and endurance. Yet it also meant that many days of effort might produce only modest returns. When that happens repeatedly, hunger becomes less like a dramatic crisis and more like a low pressure spread across time. The body is not necessarily collapsing, but it is rarely fully released from uncertainty. This helps explain why hunting cannot be treated as a simple solution to the ancient food problem. A hunt is a possibility, not a guarantee. Even in societies with refined knowledge of animal behavior, success rates can vary by season, terrain, prey type, and social circumstances. The result is that the rhythm of nourishment is uneven. There may be a sudden gain, followed by days in which the memory of that gain does more work than the food itself. Sharing also matters here. If a larger animal was taken, the return might be significant, but it often had to be divided across a social group. Division is a strength because it spreads risk, yet it also means that one moment of success does not automatically create long-lasting plenty for every person. In warm climates, meat also could not always be kept for long without effective preservation. So the meaning of success was shaped by time as well as quantity. Human origins remain visible in this pattern. Our species did not begin with secure control over animal food. It began with opportunistic access, intermittent success, and a need to combine hunting with many other food sources. That combination is itself evidence of the long gaps. If meat alone had been dependable enough, broad dietary flexibility would have mattered less. But flexibility remained essential because hunting returns were irregular. Archaeological traces of hunting show capability, intention, and repeated use of animals, yet they also sit within a much larger story of variation and interruption. A body built in that world would be a body accustomed to waiting, to making use of smaller foods between better ones, and to enduring the uncertainty of tomorrow's search. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, it becomes clear that hunger was not only the result of total failure, it also grew out of the long, ordinary intervals between more successful moments, the many days when the animal was out there somewhere, but not in human hands. What made the long intervals between hunts so important was not simply that they delayed pleasure, they delayed repair. The human body uses food not only to move through the day, but to rebuild itself after effort, cold, heat, injury, worry, and distance. In a world where hunting success arrived unevenly, nourishment also arrived unevenly, and that meant recovery could not always keep pace with need. A group might walk for hours, track signs carefully, and return with little more than smaller foods gathered along the way. Those foods could matter greatly, but they did not always replace the energy spent in pursuit. Over time, this created a familiar pattern in which the body kept going without fully leaving scarcity behind. Hunger, in that sense, was not only about empty days, it was also about incomplete replenishment after demanding ones. This becomes clearer when we return to the deeper setting of human origins. Early humans evolved in environments where movement was unavoidable, and where much of the richest food existed in forms that resisted capture. Hunting required attention, silence, coordination, and physical effort, often over difficult ground. Even when it ended well, the reward came after expenditure. When it ended poorly, the day had still taken something from the body. This is one reason the old human relationship with food cannot be understood as a simple cycle of feast and famine. Much of the time it was subtler than that. There were probably many stretches in which people remained functional, alert, and socially active while still living below the level of easy surplus. The body can endure such conditions, especially when supported by knowledge, sharing, and fallback foods. But endurance is not the same as abundance. It is survival within a narrow margin. That narrow margin is one of the oldest foundations of human hunger. It also helps explain why social behavior became so important. If hunting returns were irregular, then no single person could rely only on personal success. The uncertainty of one day had to be softened by the memory of earlier sharing and the expectation of future reciprocity. Meat from a successful kill could be distributed across a group not only because of custom, but because distribution reduced risk over time. Yet even this wise social pattern did not create certainty. Sharing could spread nourishment, but it could not make large animals appear more often, nor could it erase the long intervals when the landscape yielded little. It made uncertainty more survivable, not less real. The archaeological record, limited though it is, fits this careful picture. Animal bones marked by human processing show that meat mattered and that people repeatedly knew how to extract it. But such evidence does not show continuous access. It shows episodes. Between episodes lie days and seasons that leave fewer dramatic traces. The silence of those intervals matters. Human life was not lived only in the moments that entered the ground as durable remains. It was also lived in the ordinary span between visible successes where effort continued and hunger remained near. This is why the image of the prehistoric hunter returning triumphantly with meat, though not false in itself, can be misleading when treated as the center of the story. The center is not triumph. The center is irregularity. People kept pursuing animal food because it was valuable, but its very value reminds us that it was not constant. If it had been constant, it would have shaped human memory differently. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, the answer includes these long hunting intervals because they reveal something basic about the world that formed us. Rich nourishment existed, but it often arrived too slowly, too unevenly, and with too much uncertainty to free the body from recurring shortage. Human beings became remarkably capable within that world, yet capability did not remove the waiting. It only helped them survive it. Seasonal hunger begins with a simple truth that shaped nearly all human life before modern storage and transport. The land does not give the same answer in every month. A place that seems generous in one part of the year can become thin and quiet in another. Fruit ripens and disappears. Seeds mature and fall. Tubers may be easier to locate when the ground is moist, then harder when the soil dries or hardens. Animals change their movement in response to water, temperature, breeding cycles, and the condition of the plants they depend on. Fish become easier to catch at some times and less accessible at others. Even insects, eggs, and shellfish, which can seem like smaller and steadier resources, still follow rhythms of weather and season. This means that hunger in human history was not created only by rare disaster. It was built into the calendar of the natural world. Human origins make this especially important. Our species emerged in environments where close attention to seasonal change was not a useful extra skill but a condition of survival. Early humans had to remember when a certain valley held water, when a stand of plants became worth gathering, when animal paths became active, and when a once productive area could no longer sustain daily effort. Knowledge of those cycles helped people survive, but knowledge did not cancel the cycles themselves. It only allowed humans to move with them as carefully as possible. In that sense, the human past was shaped by a repeating pattern of relative plenty followed by narrowing options. A short period of abundance could not simply be stretched across the entire year, especially where preservation remained limited. A rich patch of fruit could fill stomachs for a brief time, but it could not remain on the branch forever. Migrating animals could pass through and leave behind empty ground. Wetlands could support dense life in one season and far less in another. The result was that many human groups lived not in constant starvation, but in repeated contraction. The range of edible choices would widen for a while, then tighten again. That tightening is one of the quiet forms of hunger. It does not always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it appears as a slower search, a longer walk, a return to tougher foods, or a growing dependence on resources that are dependable mainly because they are less desirable. This seasonal pattern also helps explain why the body and the social group had to remain flexible. When the land shifted, the diet shifted with it. When richer foods became scarce, people likely relied more heavily on fallback foods, on stored knowledge, on mobility, and on one another. The beginning of the human story is full of that kind of adjustment. Our species was not formed in a stable grocery-like world where the same foods waited every day. It was formed in a world of pulses and gaps, of moments when the landscape opened and moments when it narrowed. Even successful adaptation to such a world did not remove hunger. It only changed its shape from one season to the next. Archaeology and ethnographic comparison both support this general picture with caution. Different habitats created different rhythms, and no single seasonal pattern applies everywhere. But the broader principle is widely accepted. Wild food systems tend to be uneven across time. That unevenness matters because the body requires continuity even when the landscape does not provide it. Human metabolism asks for regular energy. Yet the older world often delivered energy in clusters. Between clusters came waiting, searching, substitution, and patience. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, seasonal hunger offers one major answer. The problem was not only that food could be scarce in absolute terms, it was that food moved through time unevenly, while human need remained constant. The earth that formed us was alive, varied, and often productive, but it rarely produced with the smooth regularity that would allow humans to forget hunger for long. Seasonal hunger was not only a matter of less food appearing on the land, it was also a matter of time moving more slowly when food became harder to reach. In generous periods, a landscape can seem almost cooperative. Plants ripen within walking distance. Animal signs are fresh and easier to follow. Water brings life into narrower corridors where it can be found with less effort. The body receives a brief sense that the world is near at hand. But when the season turns, distance begins to grow even if the map does not. A route that once provided enough may now offer very little. A wet place may shrink. A familiar patch of edible plants may have already passed its useful moment. Animals may shift their movement to cooler ground, different water sources, or more sheltered areas. The land remains alive, but it becomes less available. This is one of the quiet mechanics of human hunger. Scarcity is not always emptiness. Often, it is the stretching of effort across greater time and space. That stretching matters because human beings emerged in environments where seasonal timing controlled not only abundance, but access. The beginning of the human story was shaped by moving through landscapes whose value changed month by month. A valley could matter greatly at one time of year, and much less at another. A shoreline could provide regular nourishment in one season but become harsher, less predictable, or harder to work in another. A grassland could support grazing animals for a period and then fall silent after shifts in rain or temperature. To live in such a world required more than knowing what was edible. It required knowing when a place was worth the energy needed to reach it. Hunger therefore grew not just from limited food, but from the widening gap between effort and return. This widening gap may have been especially important in shaping human patience and memory. Early humans had to remember cycles, but memory could not force those cycles to match immediate need. A group might arrive at a familiar source slightly too early or slightly too late, and find that the landscape was not yet ready or had already passed its richer moment. That small difference in timing could matter greatly. It might not produce famine, yet it could produce a thinner day, a longer walk, a smaller portion, and a stronger dependence on tougher or less rewarding foods. This is how seasonal hunger often worked. It narrowed options gradually. The richer foods became less common, then more effortful, then absent for a while. In their place came persistence. People dug deeper, walked farther, gathered smaller things, processed harder materials, and relied more heavily on whatever the environment still offered. Human origins remain visible in this pattern because our species was shaped before large-scale storage could smooth these fluctuations. Need remained steady, but the environment delivered in pulses. The body had to bridge the distance between those pulses as best it could. Social groups likely did the same, adjusting movement, sharing, and daily labor to fit the changing season. Yet adaptation did not remove the underlying problem. It only made it survivable. The archaeological record cannot give a full calendar of ancient hunger, but seasonal use of sites, repeated exploitation of certain resources, and signs of flexible diets all fit the broader view that food availability shifted across time in ways humans had to follow closely. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, this seasonal stretching of effort offers another answer. Much of the old human struggle with food came not from complete absence, but from the fact that the world repeatedly moved nourishment farther away in time, labor, and distance. While the body kept asking for it every day, seasonal hunger also changed the meaning of confidence. In a world without stable storage, confidence could never rest on what was already secured for the distant future. It rested on patterns that might return, on memories of when the rains usually came, when certain plants usually matured, when fish usually gathered, and when animals usually crossed familiar ground. That kind of confidence was useful, but it was never complete. Weather could shift. Cold could arrive earlier. Rain could fail or come too heavily. Flooding could change routes. Heat could dry out places that had once supported food. Because of this, seasonal life was never only a cycle of repetition. It was a cycle of repetition touched by variation, and variation is where hunger often entered. Human beings did not emerge in a world where every season reliably repeated the last one. They emerged in environments where patterns existed, but where those patterns could still become unstable enough to expose the body to leaner stretches. This helps explain why seasonal hunger lasted across such a vast span of history. It was not just a local inconvenience. It was built into the relationship between human need and an environment that could only be partly anticipated. The body requires continuity. It asks again each day for energy, warmth, and repair. The landscape, by contrast, answers in intervals. There are windows when food becomes easier to gather, easier to catch, or easier to process. And then there are windows when those same tasks become slower and less rewarding. Seasonal knowledge narrowed uncertainty, but it did not remove it. A group might know that a certain resource should appear soon and still have to endure the days before it arrived. They might remember a productive place from a previous year and find that this year it had changed. They might enter a lean period with experience and still feel its weight, because experience cannot turn an absent food into a present one. This is why seasonal hunger should not be imagined only as dramatic winter hardship or a sudden collapse after failed harvests. It often lived in smaller contractions than that. Meals became less rich. Search time grew longer. More energy was spent on foods that gave less back. Diets narrowed toward what was still dependable, even if dependable meant dull, fibrous, or laborious. Bodies continued, but with less room for comfort. When we return to the beginning of the human story, this pattern feels deeply familiar. Early humans were shaped by a world of recurring environmental pulses, not by a flat line of equal daily nourishment. Their survival depended on reading these pulses with care, moving when necessary, and using a broad range of foods because no single source could be trusted for all times. That breadth of diet was a strength, yet it also reveals the depth of the problem. A species that must continually switch, substitute, and adjust is a species living under fluctuating access to energy. Seasonal hunger, therefore, did more than affect the stomach. It shaped movement, memory, division of labor, and the pace of life itself. It taught people to live with the fact that abundance was often temporary and that the return of good conditions could not be forced. Archaeological evidence from many periods supports this broad caution. People repeatedly used seasonal resources, moved across landscapes in patterned ways, and exploited food sources that changed through the year. No single habitat tells the whole story, but the larger truth remains steady. For most of human existence, food moved in rhythms, and people had to move with it. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, one answer is that hunger was not only tied to scarcity in the narrow sense, it was tied to the unstable trustworthiness of the natural calendar itself. The seasons gave, withdrew, shifted, and returned, but never with the full regularity a human body would have preferred. Hunger lasted because life was lived inside that uncertainty, one repeating year after another. Archaeology rarely tells us that ancient people were hungry in a direct sentence. It does something quieter than that. It leaves behind fragments of effort. A broken bone split for marrow, a grinding stone worn down by repeated use, teeth shaped by years of chewing coarse food, burned seeds, fish bones, shell remains, and cut marks on animal skeletons. None of these traces alone can measure the feeling of an empty stomach, and they should not be forced into certainty, but together they show a human pattern that matters very much for this question. They show that food was not simply taken from the world in easy abundance. It was pursued, processed, stretched, and used with care. That pattern begins very early in the human story. Our species did not emerge into a world that left full plates in the ground for archaeologists to find. It emerged into landscapes where nourishment had to be extracted from many different materials, often with time-consuming labor. Archaeological sites preserve some of that labor because labor leaves marks. Stone tools suggest repeated cutting, scraping, pounding, and butchering. Grinding stones suggest that small hard plant foods sometimes mattered enough to justify long processing. Fireplaces and hearths suggest that cooking helped make difficult foods more usable and more digestible. Animal bones broken in specific ways suggest that people sometimes tried to reach calories that remained hidden inside, especially fat-rich marrow or grease. These are not signs of laziness in the environment. They are signs of a narrow energy margin, where what remained after the first easy bite was still too valuable to waste. This is one of the clearest archaeological hints that hunger stayed near for much of history. If food had usually been plentiful and easy, there would have been less reason to repeatedly intensify the use of what had already been found. The human origins of this pattern are important. Early humans carried bodies with costly brains, active movement, long developmental periods, and constant metabolic needs. That kind of body requires steady energy, yet the environments in which humans evolved often offered energy in irregular forms. Archaeology cannot hear hunger directly, but it can often see the response to irregularity. It can see people returning again and again to food sources that demanded work. It can see tools designed not just to capture food, but to transform it. It can see evidence that animal carcasses were sometimes used thoroughly rather than casually. It can see traces of plant use that do not suggest luxury, but patience. In this sense, archaeology gives us less a dramatic scene than a repeated gesture, people making the most of limited returns. That gesture appears across different times and places in different forms, and caution is necessary because no single site stands for all human history. Some groups lived in richer habitats than others. Some periods were more stable than others. Some resources preserved better in the ground than others. Yet the broader pattern remains persuasive because it matches what ecology and anthropology already suggest. Human beings often lived close enough to scarcity that even smaller or harder-won calories mattered. The material record reflects that closeness. A grinding stone is not just a tool, it is a sign that nourishment sometimes came only after patience. A fractured long bone is not just food refuse. It may be a sign that energy was valuable enough to keep extracting after the obvious meat was gone. Worn teeth do not tell us everything, but they can remind us that many diets included rough textures, grit, and repeated mechanical effort. These are not the remains of effortless abundance. They are the remains of adaptation under pressure. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, archaeology does not answer with a single dramatic proof. Instead, it shows a long continuity of behaviors that make sense in a world where food was worth searching, carrying, grinding, boiling, cracking, scraping, and sharing because there was rarely enough certainty to treat calories lightly. The ground does not preserve ancient hunger as a feeling. It preserves it as a pattern of careful use, and that pattern may be one of the most honest traces the human past has left behind. Archaeological traces also matter because they reveal what people did when the easiest calories were already gone. In many ancient sites, food remains do not look like the leftovers of careless abundance. They look like the remains of repeated extraction. Bones are sometimes broken in ways that suggest access to marrow. In some cases, bones may also have been processed further, which researchers often interpret as an effort to obtain additional nourishment from what remained, though the exact context always matters. Plant traces tell a similar story. Seeds, grains, nuts, and underground storage organs could all become important, but many of them did not enter the body in a simple form. They had to be gathered in quantity, cleaned, pounded, ground, heated, or otherwise prepared. None of this proves that every ancient community lived in constant severe hunger. Archaeology cannot support that kind of certainty, but it does show something more careful and more useful. It shows that many human groups repeatedly treated food as something worth maximizing. That pattern fits a world in which calories were too valuable to leave half-used. This connects directly to the beginning of human life. Our species emerged with a large and expensive brain, with a body built for movement, and with long periods of growth in childhood. Such a species depends on regular energy, yet the landscapes of early human history did not provide regular returns in a smooth or predictable way. The result was not necessarily permanent starvation. More often it was sustained attention to small gains. Archaeology preserves that attention. A worn, grinding surface means someone repeatedly spent time turning hard plant material into something the body could better use. A shell midden means aquatic foods were gathered often enough to leave an accumulated trace, but also that many small items had to be collected one by one. Cut marks on animal bones show skill and access, yet they also remind us that animal food arrived as a body that needed work before it became nourishment. Even hearths carry this logic. Fire made some foods safer, softer, and more digestible. Cooking can increase the usefulness of food, but cooking also implies that the raw environment was not always offering energy in its easiest form. This is one of the quiet truths archaeology keeps repeating. Ancient people did not merely find food, they improved it, extended it, and extracted more from it. The need to do that so often tells us something about the pressure under which they lived. The material record also hints at unevenness across time. A site may preserve evidence of repeated occupation, then abandonment, then return. Such patterns can reflect many things, including movement, seasonality, or shifting local conditions. We must be cautious and avoid turning every gap into a story of hunger. Yet the larger rhythm still fits the broader human picture. People often followed opportunities that were temporary, and they worked hard when they found them. Human origins remain visible here because mobility, flexibility, and processing are not minor details of the old human diet. They are central features of it. A world of easy, steady abundance would leave a different kind of archaeological signature. It would leave less evidence of intensive use, less need for repeated processing, and less reason to exploit food remains so thoroughly. Instead, what often appears in the ground is a record of practical persistence. This does not mean misery at every moment. It means narrow margins managed with skill. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, archaeology helps by showing that ancient diets were often built through effort after effort, layer after layer. The ground remembers hands that cracked bones, stones that wore down under grinding, hearths that transformed tough foods, and teeth that endured rough meals over many years. Those traces do not tell us everything, but together they suggest a species living in close conversation with scarcity, making food go further because nature rarely offered the certainty to do otherwise. Archaeology is especially useful when it shows not only what people ate, but how little distance often separated eating from labour. In many ancient settings, the remains of food are mixed with the remains of effort so closely that the two are almost impossible to separate. A meal leaves behind not just bones, seeds, shells, or ash, but also broken tools, worn surfaces, chipped edges, repeated fire use, and spaces organised around preparation. This matters because it reminds us that food in the human past was rarely something passively received. It was built through sequences of work. The landscape offered raw possibilities, and human beings had to convert those possibilities into nourishment with their hands, tools, memory, and time. That repeated conversion is one of the strongest archaeological clues that scarcity remained near even when people were surviving successfully. If a world regularly offered more than enough, the material record would often show looser treatment of food. Yet what archaeology frequently preserves instead is care, repetition, and intensification. This fits the larger story of human origins. Our species emerged long before there were permanent systems capable of making food equally available through all seasons and across wide distances. The body that evolved in that older world required energy every day, but the environment often delivered it in materials that needed searching, carrying, cleaning, cutting, pounding, roasting, or grinding. Archaeology cannot tell us the exact feeling of those days, and it cannot assign one emotional state to all prehistoric people, but it can show that obtaining food was often a chain of operations rather than a simple act of finding. That difference is central to the question of why humans were hungry for most of history. Hunger persists easily in a world where nourishment exists, but only after long effort. The evidence of repeated processing also reveals something about time. Ancient people were not only investing labour in food because they preferred elaborate preparation. Often, the labour itself was part of making marginal resources useful enough to matter. Small seeds become more valuable when ground. Tough plant tissues become more usable when cooked. Hard tissues from animals yield more when broken apart or heated. These are not the gestures of excess. They are the gestures of a species learning again and again how to narrow the gap between what the land contains and what the body can absorb. This is why archaeological traces of food preparation should be read not as decorative details, but as deep signs of the human condition in older environments. They reveal that survival often depended on extracting more from less. They also remind us that many important parts of ancient diets may have been physically unimpressive in the ground. A handful of gathered seeds, a patch of roots, a scatter of shellfish, or a small animal processed carefully may never look grand in archaeological terms. Yet these smaller returns could have carried the ordinary weight of life between better moments. The ground preserves dramatic hunting episodes in one way, but it also preserves countless hints that daily nourishment often came from modest, repeated acts. Human origins remain visible in that modesty. We are a species shaped not only by rare successes, but by the patient use of ordinary resources. Even where a site suggests richness in one moment, it often still shows the tools and habits of careful use. That care is meaningful. It suggests that people could not assume the next source would appear quickly enough to justify waste. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, archaeology does not point us toward a single catastrophe or one universal shortage. It points toward a longer pattern in which calories were valuable, effort was continuous, and food was treated with a seriousness born from uncertainty. The material traces left in soil and stone do not prove constant misery. They prove something quieter and more enduring than that. They prove that for much of human existence, nourishment was close enough to pursue, but rarely secure enough to take for granted. The human body carries many signs that it was shaped in a world where food could not be trusted to arrive on time. This does not mean the body was designed for suffering, and it does not mean hunger was harmless. It means something narrower and more historically grounded. Over very long periods, humans survived in environments where energy often came irregularly, and bodies that could endure that irregularity had an advantage. One of the clearest examples is fat itself. In modern culture, body fat is often treated as a problem to be removed, but in the older human past, stored fat could serve as a quiet bridge between better days and worse ones. A body able to save some energy from a richer moment and carry it into a leaner one was not wasting resources. It was reducing risk. This is one reason hunger lasted across so much of history without always becoming immediate death. The body had ways to buffer uncertainty, but buffering uncertainty is not the same as escaping it. It is a sign that uncertainty was expected often enough to matter. Human origins help make this clearer. Our species did not emerge in an environment of steady daily intake. It emerged among shifting landscapes, variable hunting success, seasonal plants, and repeated gaps between richer opportunities. In such a world, metabolism itself became part of survival. Appetite, storage, preference, and restraint were not separate from history. They were part of how history entered the body. A strong attraction to sweetness, for example, makes sense in a world where sweet foods often signaled valuable energy. A taste for fat also makes sense in landscapes where dense calories could be rare and important. These preferences do not prove that ancient humans always found such foods easily. In a way, they suggest the opposite. Valuable foods tend to leave stronger marks on behavior when they are beneficial but not always secure. The same is true of the body's tendency to adjust when intake falls. Human physiology can slow, conserve, and reallocate under leaner conditions. This ability is not perfect, and it comes with costs, but it reveals something important about the environments that shaped us. A body that could not respond at all to food scarcity would have struggled in the older world. The ability to endure periods of shortage, even imperfectly, helped humans remain alive inside fluctuating ecologies. Yet this adaptation also carries a quiet irony. The very traits that once reduced risk under scarcity can feel mismatched in a world of continuous availability. The body still responds seriously to calorie-dense food because for most of history such foods were valuable opportunities, not ordinary background conditions. This does not turn the title into a simple biological conclusion, and it should not be exaggerated into a neat story of destiny. Human biology is complex, and many factors shape hunger, body weight, and health. Still, the broader historical point is well supported. Our species bears metabolic traces of a long relationship with irregular nourishment. That relationship began close to the origin of human life itself. Before fields and markets, Before refrigeration and transport, the body had to cope with a world in which the next meal was often uncertain in timing, quantity, or quality. This is why the human body should not be imagined as belonging naturally to permanent abundance. It belongs to a deeper past in which energy had to be saved, sought, and stretched. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, part of the answer lies not only outside the body, in climate, prey, and season, but inside the body as well. We are looking at a species whose physiology was formed under repeated exposure to scarcity, a species that learned not to erase hunger, but to survive alongside it for long stretches of time. The human body was not shaped only to seek food when it was absent. It was also shaped to notice food intensely when it appeared. This is one of the clearest biological clues that scarcity stood near the center of human history. In a world where energy arrived unevenly, the body could not afford indifference. It had to respond quickly to valuable opportunities. Foods rich in sugar, fat, or easily digested starch could matter far beyond their size because they offered concentrated energy in environments where much of the diet may have been bulkier, slower to process, or less predictable in return. A strong sensory response to such foods makes sense in that setting. It is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence of historical pressure. Human origins help explain why this response became so important. Early humans lived in landscapes where the difference between a highly rewarding food and an ordinary one could shape not just pleasure, but resilience. A honey source, a fatty animal tissue, a dense cluster of edible seeds, or a starchy underground plant could provide more useful energy than many hours spent on poorer materials. When those richer foods appeared, paying attention to them mattered. Preference itself became adaptive. This is one reason the body does not approach all foods as equal. It reacts with greater urgency to some than to others because, across long stretches of evolutionary time, some foods helped bridge uncertainty more effectively. The same logic applies to hunger signals themselves. Hunger is not merely a simple alarm that turns on when the body is empty. It is part of a wider regulatory system that helps organisms balance present intake against future uncertainty. In the older human world, where the timing of the next substantial meal was often unknown, that system needed flexibility. People had to keep functioning through changing levels of intake, fluctuating workloads, and repeated intervals between richer returns. The body therefore evolved not as a machine expecting constant steady supply, but as a living system prepared to negotiate irregularity. This negotiation has limits, and it should not be romanticized. Scarcity harms bodies. Hunger impairs strength, mood, immunity, growth, and recovery. Yet the fact that humans survived under such conditions for so long means the body carried some capacity to buffer lean periods, to conserve, to draw on reserves, and to remain active even when intake was inconsistent. That buffering capacity is itself historical evidence. It points back toward the beginning of human life, when natural environments rarely delivered equal nourishment day after day. Another important sign lies in the way the body values efficiency. Humans can extract considerable benefit from cooked food, processed starches, and foods that require less chewing and less digestive effort. Cooking, cutting, pounding, and grinding all increase the usefulness of certain foods, but the body's readiness to benefit from such changes also reflects a long history of working to make calories more available. Biology and culture met each other very early here. Human bodies were not separate from food processing traditions. They were shaped alongside them. This does not mean there was one single prehistoric diet or one fixed metabolic pattern shared by everyone in every place. Human populations have always lived under varied conditions. Still, the broader principle remains widely supported. Our physiology reflects long adaptation to variable access, not guaranteed abundance. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, the body gives part of the answer by the way it reacts, stores, prefers, and endures. It behaves like the body of a species that often had to treat rich food as rare, ordinary food as laborious, and the next meal as something never fully secured in advance. The body's ability to live with irregular food should never be confused with comfort. Adaptation is not the same as ease. A human being can endure gaps between richer meals, can draw on stored energy, can slow certain processes, and can continue moving through a lean period. But all of this comes at a cost. That cost is part of the reason hunger mattered so deeply for most of history. It did not always kill quickly, yet it could still shape daily life through fatigue, slower recovery, reduced resilience, and a constant narrowing of choices. This is one of the most important biological truths behind the title. Humans were not hungry for most of history because the body was poorly made. Humans were hungry because the body was made to cope with uncertainty, and coping is always a sign that uncertainty has been present for a very long time. Human origins help keep this in focus. Our species emerged in environments where the flow of calories was often unstable, but the demands of the body remained steady. The brain required energy, muscles required energy, childhood growth required energy, pregnancy and infant care required energy, movement across land required energy, repair after illness, cold, or injury required energy. In such a world, any biological trait that helped stretch available nourishment a little further could matter. Yet stretching is not abundance. It is only a way of reducing immediate danger. A body drawing on its reserves is surviving a shortage, not escaping the existence of shortage. This is why the human body tells such a careful story. It does not suggest that scarcity was rare. It suggests that scarcity was common enough to leave a mark on appetite, storage, and energy management. The body also reveals how close hunger stood to the ordinary rhythm of life. A species built only for constant plenty would not need to respond so strongly to dense calories, would not benefit so much from storing extra energy, and would not endure temporary reduction with the same flexibility. Human biology instead looks like the biology of a species shaped by repeated interruption. Meals could be delayed, portions could vary, better foods could arrive suddenly, and then vanish again. In response, the body became cautious in its own way. It learned to value energy when available and to manage its use when intake fell. That biological caution fits the broader archaeological and ecological record very well. The world that formed humans was rarely empty of food, but it was often unreliable in how and when food could be turned into nourishment. This is also why the modern experience of near-constant access feels historically unusual. For most of the human story, the body and the environment were in a more direct and more difficult conversation. Weather affected plants, plants affected animals, animals affected hunting returns. Seasonal changes altered movement, labor, and risk. The body had to meet all of this without any guarantee that tomorrow would resemble today. Seen from that long perspective, hunger was not merely an interruption of normal life. It was woven into normal life as one of the pressures the body had to anticipate. That does not mean every day was severe, or that all ancient people lived in unbroken suffering. Such certainty would go beyond the evidence. It means something more measured. For a very long time, many humans lived in conditions where the body's biological tools for enduring scarcity were regularly relevant. They were not emergency features waiting unused in the background. They were part of everyday survival. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, the body answers with remarkable honesty. It answers by the way it saves, the way it craves, the way it adapts, and the way it keeps functioning under less than ideal conditions. These are not signs of a species born into abundance. They are signs of a species shaped by a deep past in which enough food often existed, but stable freedom from hunger rarely did. Small human populations were not protected from hunger simply because they were small. In some ways, their size made the food problem even more fragile. A small group could move more easily than a village or a town, and that mobility was often an advantage in the deep human past. But mobility did not create food. It only allowed people to keep searching when one place began to fail. A foraging band, an early settlement, or a scattered community might depend heavily on the immediate area around it, and the immediate area always had limits. Wild plants could be gathered down, animal movement could shift away, water could change the pattern of life across a region. A resource that had supported a group for a time could suddenly become thinner, not because the people were careless, but because local food systems are delicate even when human numbers are low. This is important because modern imagination sometimes treats the ancient world as empty land with endless food waiting for a few people to collect it. The older human reality was much narrower than that. Human origins help explain why. Our species emerged not into a world of limitless untouched abundance, but into ecosystems where edible energy was spread unevenly across time and space. Even a modest number of humans had to compete with seasonality, animal behavior, plant cycles, distance, weather, and other hungry creatures. In that setting, a small population could survive, but survival often depended on maintaining a careful balance with the local environment. That balance was not guaranteed. If a group lingered too long in one area, nearby plant foods might become less rewarding to gather. Small prey could become harder to find. Larger animals might avoid familiar zones of human activity. If water sources shifted, the whole pattern of movement around food could change with them. Hunger, therefore, grew not only from the total amount of food in the world, but from how easily a specific group could access enough food in the place where it happened to be living at that moment. That local scale matters greatly. There may have been food somewhere beyond the horizon, but the body lives on what can be reached, carried, processed, and shared before exhaustion overtakes effort. Small groups were especially exposed to this local fragility because they had limited labor and limited redundancy. If several people were injured, ill, elderly, very young, or occupied with care work, the effective food-gathering strength of the group could narrow quickly. A larger society can sometimes absorb such variation more easily. A smaller one often feels it immediately. This does not mean early humans were weak or poorly organized. On the contrary, cooperation was one of their great strengths. But cooperation works inside ecological limits. It can distribute risk, not abolish it. This is one reason human origins and social life are so closely linked. Our species survived in part because individuals were not entirely alone with their own luck. Food could be shared, knowledge could be pooled, movement could be coordinated. Yet the very importance of sharing tells us something about the underlying instability of the system. If food had been regularly abundant and secure, social buffering would have mattered less. Instead, the human story suggests that shared effort became crucial because local food systems could fail a group in quiet ways long before any dramatic catastrophe appeared. A few less successful days, a thinning patch of gathered plants, a herd shifting to different ground, a drying stream or a poorly timed stay in one place could all narrow the food margin. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, this fragility of small populations offers a careful answer. Hunger persisted not simply because the world lacked food in the abstract, but because real human groups lived at local scales where food systems were easily disturbed, quickly exhausted, and never fully secure for long. In the beginning of our story, being few did not mean being safe. It often meant living within a small circle of dependence, where every shift in land, water, plants, animals, and human capacity could be felt almost at once in the body. Small populations also lived inside a narrow chain of dependency across generations. A group is never made only of active gatherers or successful hunters. It also includes infants who cannot feed themselves, children still learning the landscape, older adults whose knowledge may be deep even when their strength is reduced, injured people recovering slowly, and those occupied with pregnancy, nursing, or care. This matters because hunger is not measured only by what the strongest adults can obtain on their best days. It is measured by whether a whole social unit can be sustained across ordinary days, weaker days, and changing seasons. In the deep human past, that balance was often delicate. A small group might contain extraordinary practical knowledge, but knowledge still had to be carried through bodies that differed in age, strength, and immediate need. Human origins help explain why this was such an important pressure. Our species developed long childhoods, intense parental investment, and unusually dependent early development compared with many other animals. A human child takes time to become nutritionally productive. That means any group had to support members who consumed energy before they could reliably help acquire it. In a world of uncertain food, this created a very specific form of strain. The group was never searching only for today's meal for the most capable adults. It was also searching for enough continuity to keep children growing, to help mothers recover, to support older knowledge holders, and to carry weaker members through lean intervals. A small population could manage this through cooperation, but cooperation does not remove biological arithmetic. If returns from the environment narrowed, the burden was felt unevenly and immediately. The same quantity of food that might barely sustain a group in one moment could become insufficient in another if births increased, if illness spread, or if repeated low returns prevented recovery. This is one reason population structure belongs in the history of hunger. Scarcity was not simply a property of landscapes, it was also a property of how many dependent bodies had to be supported at once. The beginning of the human story was therefore shaped not only by what the land contained, but by the age structure of the people moving across it. A band with many small children would face a different food pressure than a band made mostly of healthy adults. A settlement with older members who could guide movement and memory might also contain bodies less able to walk long distances or process hardship. These are not signs of weakness, they are signs of being human. Our species survives through interdependence, and interdependence becomes especially visible when food is unreliable. That is why sharing mattered so much. Food sharing was not merely generosity in an abstract moral sense. It was one of the mechanisms through which a small population kept its generational chain intact. Yet sharing also means that success is diluted across need. One good return may have to nourish many people whose needs are not equal and whose capacities differ. This does not make sharing ineffective. It makes it necessary under conditions where no one can count on private security. Archaeology and anthropology both support the broader caution that human groups often depended on social buffering because environmental returns were uneven. No single model fits every past society, but the larger logic remains stable. Hunger stayed near because human communities were carrying more than the needs of the present moment. They were carrying children into adulthood, carrying memory across elders, carrying illness, repair, and dependency through time. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, one answer lies in this fragile social composition. Small groups were not just finding food for whoever happened to be strongest. They were trying to maintain a whole human chain of life with limited, fluctuating energy. In such a system, even modest instability in the environment could become serious, because the margin between enough for survival and too little for full continuity was often very small. The fragility of small populations becomes clearest when we remember that they could not separate food from continuity. A group was not only trying to survive the present day, it was also trying to remain a group tomorrow, next season, and into the next generation. That made hunger more than a temporary shortage of calories. It made hunger a pressure on social endurance itself. In a small human community, each person mattered disproportionately. The loss of one skilled gatherer, one experienced tracker, one older memory holder, or one healthy caregiver could narrow the group's capacity in ways that larger populations might absorb more easily. This is one reason ancient hunger cannot be understood only by looking at landscapes or total food supply. It must also be understood by looking at how thinly a small group's knowledge, labour and resilience were spread across its members. Human origins matter here because our species did not evolve as a solitary feeder. We evolved through cooperation, long learning, and dependence across age groups. A human child requires years of support. A young adult may contribute labour but still need guidance. An older adult may contribute deep knowledge even when physical strength declines. Pregnancy, nursing, injury, illness, grief, and exhaustion all shape the real capacity of a group. In such a system, hunger was never just about the amount of food found on a given day. It was about whether the group could continue performing its human tasks while that food remained uncertain. A few weaker returns in succession could affect movement, decision-making, infant care, recovery from illness, and the ability to invest in the future. This is where the history of hunger becomes especially quiet and especially human. Collapse did not need to be sudden to be serious. A group might continue functioning while gradually becoming more vulnerable, less mobile, less able to absorb bad weather, or less able to support dependent members through a lean period. That vulnerability may have been one of the oldest conditions of human life. It was not always visible as famine. Often it lived in the narrowing of options. A group with fewer strong adults might avoid longer searches, even if better food lay farther away. A group caring for very young children might move more slowly or accept poorer local returns because mobility itself carried risk. A group weakened by repeated low intake might have less strength to exploit difficult resources fully. Human origins remain visible in all of this because our species is built around social interdependence. But interdependence creates both strength and exposure. It allows knowledge to be shared, food to be distributed, and hardship to be softened across people. Yet it also means that one person's vulnerability becomes part of the whole group's food equation. This is why the small scale of ancient populations did not automatically make life easier. Small groups could adjust quickly, but they also had very little room for repeated strain. Their survival depended on maintaining a living balance between environment, labor, care, and memory. Archaeology cannot always reveal these fragile social calculations directly, but anthropology and evolutionary reasoning support the broader pattern. Human groups often survived because they were cooperative, not because they had secure abundance. Cooperation was a response to instability, not proof that instability had disappeared. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, this helps complete the picture of small populations. Hunger persisted because the basic human unit was demanding in a very specific way. It was not just a cluster of mouths, it was a chain of dependency, skill, care, and biological difference trying to sustain itself with fluctuating access to energy. In that older world, a small group could remain alive for generations and still live very close to shortage, because enough food for bare survival was not the same as enough food for security, recovery, growth, and continuity. The ancient human story was therefore not simply about finding calories in nature. It was about keeping a fragile social body intact while nature continued to provide those calories unevenly, and that is one of the deepest reasons hunger stayed beside our species for so long. Agriculture is often imagined as the great human escape from hunger, the turning point when people finally stopped depending on uncertain landscapes and began producing their own food. There is truth in that image, but only part of the truth. Farming did increase the human ability to shape the food supply, yet it did not create immediate safety. In some ways, it introduced a new kind of fragility. Before agriculture, people often relied on many food sources spread across a landscape. After agriculture, many communities began to rely more heavily on a smaller number of plants grown in fixed places and tied to fixed seasons. This could support larger populations, but it also narrowed the system. A field could fail more completely than a mixed foraging landscape. A crop might depend on rain arriving at the right time, on soil remaining productive, on pests staying limited, and on human labor being available during critical weeks. If one part of that chain weakened, the consequences could spread widely. This is why agriculture should not be treated as the end of hunger. It was a major shift in food history, but it also changed hunger from a more mobile uncertainty into a more concentrated one. Human origins help make this paradox clearer. Our species evolved in a world where food was irregular, but also diverse. Early humans survived by moving, substituting, and combining many partial returns. Agriculture did not erase the biological and ecological pressures behind that older pattern. It reorganized them. Instead of asking each day what the wider landscape might yield, farming communities often asked whether a few key crops would succeed well enough to carry many people through the year. That question could produce larger stores in good times, yet it also tied survival to narrow windows of success. Seed had to go into the ground at the right time, labor had to be sustained, water had to be adequate, harvest had to be protected. Food then had to last until the next cycle. This was not the removal of uncertainty. It was uncertainty gathered into a more visible seasonal structure. Archaeology and early history both support this broad caution. Farming societies often became more settled, more populous, and more dependent on staple foods, but larger food production did not mean evenly nourished bodies. In many places, agricultural life could still include hard labor, limited dietary variety, seasonal shortage, and vulnerability to crop failure. A community may have had fields and still lived close to hunger if the harvest was poor, if storage was insufficient, or if too many people depended on too little surplus. This is one of the central ironies of agriculture. It created the conditions for population growth, but population growth itself could intensify the pressure on food. More mouths could be supported, yet more mouths also meant smaller margins for error. A bad season in a foraging system might force movement or substitution. A bad season in a farming system could threaten the main foundation of the entire community. Human origins remain present even here, because the body still required continuity while the environment still answered in uneven rhythms. Farming did not change the daily needs of children, pregnant women, older adults, workers, and the sick. It only changed the form through which energy reached them. That form could be productive, but it was never fully secure. A field does not guarantee a meal any more than a herd guarantees a kill. It creates a pathway toward food, but the pathway remains exposed to weather, timing, soil, labor, and chance. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, agriculture becomes important not because it solved the problem, but because it reveals how difficult the problem really was. Even after humans learned to sow, tend, and harvest, they still did not step into a world of stable abundance. They stepped into a new negotiation with hunger, one built around planted landscapes instead of wild ones. The paradox is simple and deep. Agriculture made more food possible, yet for a very long time it did not make freedom from hunger ordinary. It changed the structure of scarcity, but it did not end the human need to live close beside it. Agriculture also changed the relationship between time and hunger in a profound way. In a foraging world, food uncertainty was spread across many daily decisions. In a farming world, much of that uncertainty became concentrated into a few critical moments. A crop can take months to grow, yet it can be damaged in a short period by failed rain, unseasonal cold, flood, pests, plant disease, or conflict that interrupts labor. This means the agricultural year can feel full of effort long before it becomes full of food. People may plow, sow, weed, guard, and wait, all while depending on the hope that the harvest will eventually justify the work. If that harvest comes in weakly, the loss is not only immediate, it can echo across the entire cycle ahead. Seed for the next planting may be reduced. Reserves for winter or the dry season may narrow. The community may enter the next year already less secure than before. This is one reason farming did not remove hunger from human life. It often made hunger more seasonal, more visible, and more tightly linked to the success or failure of a few essential staples. Human origins help clarify why this mattered so much. Our species did not evolve with the expectation that one or two domesticated plants would carry the nutritional burden of an entire population. For most of the deeper human past, people dealt with uncertainty by diversification, by combining many foods, many places, and many strategies. Agriculture could still involve some diversity, but in many regions it pushed communities toward heavier reliance on a small number of crops that became central to survival. That concentration had advantages. It allowed storage, denser settlement, and the growth of larger populations. Yet concentration also creates fragility. When more human lives depend on fewer biological foundations, any disturbance to those foundations can spread hunger quickly. A wild landscape may fail in one resource while still offering another. A field planted with staple crops can fail in a more unified way. The human body, meanwhile, still asks each day for nourishment, recovery, and continuity. It does not care that the crop is still green and months from harvest. It only feels the distance between present need and future food. This is part of the agricultural paradox. Farming gave humans more control over food production, but control was always incomplete. Soil could be exhausted, rain could arrive late. Too much moisture could damage what too little moisture also threatened. Weeds could compete with planted crops. Animals could enter and destroy. Human labor itself could be interrupted by sickness, injury, war, or the need to divide attention among many tasks. Even when harvest succeeded, the result was not always a balanced diet. Some agricultural societies appear to have depended heavily on staple grains or other primary crops, which could sustain populations but also narrow dietary variety. That does not mean foragers were always better nourished. The comparison is far more complex than that. It means only that agriculture should not be imagined as an automatic arrival into nutritional security. Archaeology, environmental history, and early written records all support this broader caution. Settled life and productive fields did not guarantee freedom from seasonal shortage. In fact, fixed settlement could sometimes make communities less able to respond flexibly when local production failed. A mobile group might move. A farming village was more tied to its fields, storage places, dwellings, and social structure. Human origins remain visible here because the old problem never disappeared. The challenge was always how to carry fragile human bodies through uneven flows of energy. Agriculture changed the shape of that flow, but not its basic instability. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, this helps deepen the answer. Hunger did not survive farming because farming was useless. Hunger survived because growing food is not the same as guaranteeing it, and because the human need for steady nourishment remained more constant than any harvest ever was. Agriculture deepened the human struggle with hunger in one more quiet way. It tied food not only to the land, but to success across time. A foraging group could fail in one place and still search elsewhere. A farming community often had to remain faithful to a cycle it had already begun. Once seed was planted, labour invested, and fields prepared, much of the year's hope was anchored in the future. That future could not be hurried. Grain had to mature, roots had to develop, fruit trees had to survive season after season before giving dependable returns. This created a very different emotional and biological distance between effort and nourishment. The body needed food in the present, but agriculture often promised it only later. That gap was one of the reasons hunger survived even in settled landscapes. People could be surrounded by fields and still not yet have anything ready to eat. Human origins help explain why this mattered so much. Our species was shaped in a world where food uncertainty was old, but agricultural life introduced a form of delayed dependence that could be especially harsh. Instead of living from many scattered opportunities, communities increasingly placed trust in planted systems that required time, stability, and favourable conditions over long stretches. The harvest, when it came, could be substantial, yet the months before harvest remained exposed. A village might work hard and still pass through a hungry interval before crops were ready. If the previous stores were low, that interval could become especially severe. This pattern appears in many agricultural histories, where the period before a new harvest is often remembered as a thinner season, not because the land was empty in an absolute sense, but because the main source of nourishment was still locked in growth. Agriculture, therefore, did not simply produce food, it also produced waiting, and waiting, when reserves are low, is another form of hunger. This helps reveal the deeper paradox. Farming increased human productivity, yet it also increased dependence on continuity. The system worked only if one season could carry the body into the next. A poor harvest was not just one bad moment, it weakened the bridge between years. Storage might shrink, seed might be consumed instead of saved, livestock might be reduced. Labour capacity could decline if people entered the next cycle weaker than before. In that way, hunger in agricultural societies could become cumulative. It could move quietly from one season into another, not always as open famine, but as reduced resilience, thinner margins, and growing vulnerability. The archaeological and historical record supports this broad caution. Early farming communities often succeeded in sustaining larger populations, but larger populations also became more exposed to repeated shortfalls if staple systems underperformed. Settled life created deeper attachments to place, yet attachment to place can become a burden when local production falls. A field is not mobile. A planted calendar cannot easily be rewritten halfway through the year. Human origins remain visible even here because the body still lived by daily need while agriculture worked by delayed return. The old tension between steady human metabolism and uneven environmental supply did not disappear. It simply took on the shape of sowing, tending, waiting, and hoping that the year would hold together. This is why agriculture should be understood not as the end of hunger, but as a long historical compromise with it. It made larger surpluses possible, but it also made entire communities dependent on fragile chains of timing, weather, labour, and storage. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, agriculture completes the paradox rather than erasing it. The fields may have looked more controlled than the wild landscape, yet beneath that appearance remained the same old truth. Human beings still depended on energy arriving in time, and for much of history, even cultivated land could not guarantee that it would. Storage seems simple from the perspective of the modern world. Food is gathered, placed somewhere safe, and kept for later. But for most of human history, that middle step was far more difficult than it appears. Food does not naturally wait for human need. Meat spoils. Fresh plants wilt, rot, or lose value quickly. Moisture damages grain. Insects invade. Rodents gnaw through containers. Mold spreads silently. Heat shortens the life of stored food, and damp air can undo months of labour. This is why the history of hunger cannot be explained only by asking whether people could find or grow enough food. It must also ask whether food could survive long enough to bridge one season to the next. For most of the human past, that bridge was fragile. Human origins help explain why this mattered so deeply. Our species emerged in environments where many foods were consumed close to the moment they were obtained. A gathered plant, a hunted animal, a clutch of eggs, or a cache of shellfish could support life for a short period, but not necessarily for long. Before the development of reliable preservation methods and secure storage systems, abundance had a tendency to dissolve. A successful hunt could feed a group, but much of the meat might have to be eaten quickly, shared widely, or lost to time. A good season of plants could fill stomachs for days or weeks, yet without durable storage, the surplus could not easily become future security. This means one of the oldest human problems was not only obtaining calories, but holding on to them. The body needed continuity, but the material world often refused to provide it. Agriculture later made storage more important, but it did not make storage easy. Grain can be stored better than fresh meat or fruit, yet grain is not immortal. It must be dried properly, protected from dampness, shielded from pests, and kept in containers or spaces that remain secure over time. All of that requires labor, planning, and sometimes social organization strong enough to defend stores from theft, conflict, or simple neglect. In many early societies, even when food was successfully harvested, a large part of the struggle was only beginning. Food had to survive the months ahead. If it did not, then the harvest could not fully protect the body from the next lean period. This is one reason hunger remained near even in places where people had fields, tools, and knowledge. Storage failure can quietly undo production. Human origins remain visible here because the old pattern never truly vanished. The deeper human body still lived from day to day, while food systems were trying to stretch nourishment across time. That stretching required more than containers. It required trust in materials, weather, labor, and memory. Someone had to know what to dry, how long to dry it, when to seal it, where to keep it, and how to ration it. Even when all of that was done carefully, nature and time could still interfere. A humid season could damage stored grain. Insects could multiply unnoticed. Rodents could destroy more than they consumed. A container could break. A hidden store could be found. A community under stress might eat too much too early because the future itself was uncertain. This is why storage should never be imagined as a complete answer to hunger. It was an important human achievement, but for much of history it remained partial, vulnerable, and unevenly available. Archaeology supports this larger caution. We find pits, vessels, storage spaces, and evidence of preserved staples in many contexts. But we also see that reliable long-term preservation was limited by environment, technology, and local conditions. Some communities stored better than others. Some climates allowed longer protection than others. Yet the broader truth stays steady. Food that exists is not the same as food that lasts. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, this distinction becomes essential. People could gather, hunt, plant, and harvest, and still live close to shortage because the world kept pulling food back toward decay. For most of human existence, the surplus of one moment was always under threat from time itself, and that made freedom from hunger far more difficult than simple production alone would suggest. The act of keeping food safe created new responsibilities that could easily fail. Preserved food had to be watched. Containers had to remain sealed. Dry places had to stay dry. Stored grain had to be guarded not only from insects and rodents, but also from theft, conflict, and simple human desperation. Food that could last longer became something worth protecting, and protection itself required labor, attention, and social coordination. This meant that storing food did not remove hunger from human life. It transformed part of the struggle into the problem of defending and managing reserves across time. Human origins help clarify why this change mattered so much. Early humans had long been accustomed to living close to the moment of food acquisition. The body received nourishment soon after effort. When societies began to rely more heavily on storage, food became something that could exist in the present while belonging to the future. That difference required discipline. A stored supply had to last until the next opportunity for replenishment. If a community consumed it too quickly, the future would narrow. If the stored supply was damaged or lost, the consequences could spread through an entire season. The body still asked for daily nourishment, but now the answer depended on whether the group could maintain a careful balance between present appetite and future security. This balance was rarely simple. A poor harvest might mean that the stored supply was already small before the year truly began. A long winter or a dry season might stretch that supply further than expected. Illness, migration, or conflict might interrupt the work needed to maintain storage spaces. A single unnoticed infestation could slowly reduce a store that once seemed sufficient. Even when preservation was technically possible, the human system surrounding it had to function well enough to sustain the protection of that food over many months. Archaeology often reveals evidence of storage structures, pits, jars, granaries, or preserved staples, but these traces do not guarantee that the food inside always lasted as planned. They simply show that people tried to create continuity across seasons. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes the attempt was only partially successful. The presence of storage therefore tells us something important about the persistence of hunger. If food had naturally lasted long enough to bridge lean periods, elaborate systems for protection would have been less necessary. The very effort devoted to storing food suggests that people understood how easily time could steal the surplus they had worked to obtain. This effort also reveals another quiet difficulty. Stored food must often be rationed. Rationing requires judgment about the future, and the future is never fully known. If a community believes the next harvest will arrive soon, it may eat more freely. If the harvest arrives late or fails, the stored food may already be gone. If people fear the future too strongly, they may restrict consumption even when it is not yet necessary. Both choices carry risk, and both reveal the same truth. Storage extends time, but it does not eliminate uncertainty. Human origins remain visible even in these later developments, because the body was still living inside an old pattern. It required reliable energy day after day, while the world continued to deliver that energy unevenly across seasons. Storage was an attempt to smooth those uneven rhythms, but the smoothing was rarely perfect. The human past is therefore full of efforts to hold nourishment steady against the forces that tried to undo it. Containers were built, grain was dried, meat was smoked or salted where possible, food was hidden, guarded, and rationed. All of these actions show a species trying to push back against the instability of nature. Yet the persistence of hunger across so much of history shows that the effort was only partly successful. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, storage becomes part of the answer because it reveals how difficult it was to hold on to abundance once it briefly appeared. Food could be found, grown, or harvested, but keeping it alive across time required constant vigilance, and even then the future could still take it away. The difficulty of storage becomes clearest when we remember that stored food is never just food. It is a promise stretched across time, and promises are fragile when made against weather, decay, hunger, and uncertainty. A full store can look reassuring in one season and then slowly reveal its weakness in the next. Grain may last, but only if dryness holds. Dried foods may survive, but only if moisture, insects, rodents, and theft are kept away. Salted, smoked, or otherwise preserved foods can extend nourishment, but preservation itself depends on materials, knowledge, labor, and local conditions that are never perfectly stable. This is why storage did not simply create security. It created a temporary defense against insecurity. That defense could be impressive, but it was always under pressure. Human origins help place this in a wider frame. For most of the deep human past, our species lived close to the rhythm of immediate acquisition. Food entered life soon after effort, and when it did not, the body felt the gap directly. Storage emerged as one of the great human attempts to widen the distance between obtaining food and needing it. In principle, this was revolutionary. In practice, it remained incomplete for a very long time. The body still required continuity, while stored reserves remained vulnerable to time and chance. This gap between biological need and material preservation may be one of the quiet reasons hunger lasted so long even in more settled worlds. A community could have worked hard, harvested well enough, and still find that the reserve did not fully bridge the months ahead. The problem was not only how much had been stored, but how long it could remain useful and how wisely it could be managed. This is where storage reveals its deepest paradox. The more a society depends on reserves, the more it must trust the future to resemble its plan. But the future rarely behaves so neatly. A winter may last longer, a dry season may deepen, conflict may prevent access to stored food, a bad harvest may follow a merely modest one, turning what had seemed like a manageable reserve into an inadequate one. The body experiences these failures very directly. Meals become smaller, diets become narrower, anxiety about timing enters everyday life. Hunger, in this setting, is not always the sudden absence of food. It is the slow realization that what was meant to last may not last long enough. Archaeology and historical evidence support this broad pattern with caution. Storage pits, jars, granaries, and preserved staples show that many societies did learn how to hold food across time. Yet the continued recurrence of lean seasons, periodic shortages, and food insecurity in historical farming communities shows that preservation alone did not create abundance secure enough to free most people from hunger. Some climates supported storage more effectively than others. Some societies organized protection and rationing more successfully than others. But the larger truth remains steady. Storage made food more durable, not invulnerable. It helped humans resist the old instability of nature, but it did not defeat that instability. Human origins remain visible here because the ancient tension never disappeared. The body still needed daily nourishment, while the food system was trying to make one harvest serve many months. That is an enormous burden to place on any material reserve. A single store had to stand between present life and future uncertainty. If it weakened, the whole community felt it. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, storage completes the lesson. Hunger did not survive because humans failed to become clever. It survived because even cleverness had limits against rot, pests, weather, time, and the sheer difficulty of carrying energy safely across seasons. Stored food was one of humanity's greatest achievements, but for most of history it remained a thin wall against a very old problem. Behind that wall stood the same human body, asking each day for continuity in a world where continuity was never guaranteed. As human communities grew larger, hunger changed scale. In smaller groups, food insecurity could remain local, shaped by a river that ran low, a herd that moved away, or a patch of land that no longer yielded enough. In growing villages, towns, and early states, the same old problem of uneven nourishment began to spread across many more bodies at once. Larger populations could produce more food, but they also required more regular success. A field that failed now mattered not just to one family or one band, but to entire settlements whose lives had become closely tied to the same harvest, the same storage spaces, and the same landscape. This is one of the quiet reasons hunger remained so persistent in human history. Population growth did not eliminate scarcity. It often made scarcity more consequential. Human origins help explain why. Our species emerged in flexible, mobile systems where people could often respond to pressure by moving, diversifying, or lowering local demand on a single area. As societies became denser and more settled, that flexibility narrowed. Houses, fields, roads, irrigation works, storage facilities, and social obligations tied people more firmly to place. The food system became more productive in some ways, but also less able to change course quickly when conditions turned against it. A poor harvest in a dense agricultural community was not just a disappointing season. It could become a widespread strain because so many lives were now linked to the same narrow foundations. This helps reveal an important paradox. Civilization increased organization, planning, and production, yet the very success of that growth created new exposure to hunger. More children survived into later stages of life. More adults remained in one place. More labor could be directed into farming, building, and storage. But more people also meant that the margin for error became thinner. A region that might once have supported scattered populations through mixed strategies could become more fragile when a large settled population depended on predictable crop yields year after year. The body still needed food every day, but now the pathway from soil to stomach had to serve many more people without serious interruption. That pathway could be disturbed by drought, flood, plant disease, conflict, exhausted soil, or failures in labor and transport. Even when total food production increased over time, distribution could remain uneven. An uneven distribution is one of the oldest companions of hunger. The beginning of the human story remains visible here, because larger societies did not change the biological reality of dependence. Infants still needed feeding. Workers still needed recovery. Pregnant women, older adults, the ill, and the injured still required nourishment. A bigger population is not simply a larger number, it is a larger field of dependency. This is why hunger in early civilizations was often not a sign that people had forgotten how to grow food. It was a sign that producing enough at scale, storing enough at scale, and moving enough at scale were all extraordinarily difficult tasks. The more a society expanded, the more it had to hold together many fragile links at once. A breakdown in one part could travel outward. If roads became unsafe, grain might not arrive where it was needed. If floods damaged fields, the loss could affect many households at the same time. If harvests were only modest for several seasons in a row, the pressure could accumulate quietly long before open famine appeared. Archaeology and history both support this broad caution. The rise of larger settlements and states did not create a smooth upward path away from hunger. It created food systems powerful enough to support many people, yet still vulnerable enough to leave many people near shortage. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, growing civilization becomes part of the answer because scale itself can intensify fragility. The human world became denser, more organized, and more impressive, but the old problem remained underneath. More mouths, more dependence, and more fixed systems meant that food had to succeed more consistently than nature, labor, and history could reliably guarantee. As societies became larger, hunger also became more layered. It was no longer only a matter of whether the land produced enough in a broad sense. It became a matter of whether food could move through a growing human structure without being delayed, lost, hoarded, damaged, or unevenly shared. A village can sometimes feel the limits of its nearby fields directly. A larger town or early state depends on something more complicated. It depends on coordination. Grain may need to travel from one district to another. Labor may need to be organized at the right moment for planting, irrigation, harvest, and storage. Animals may need pasture in one season and protection in another. Water systems may need repair. Roads or routes must remain usable. Officials, households, and workers must all continue doing their part well enough for nourishment to reach the body in time. This is one reason hunger remains so persistent in larger civilizations. Bigger systems could produce more food overall, but they also created more points where food could fail to become available to the people who needed it most. Human origins help clarify why this mattered so much. Our species emerged in smaller and more direct relationships with food, where the distance between local ecology and the body was short and visible. As populations grew, that distance widened. A person might live near stores of grain and still not eat well if the grain was being held elsewhere, moved elsewhere, taxed away, spoiled in storage, or reserved for future use. The old biological problem remained exactly the same. The body still needed daily continuity, but the route from production to nourishment became more abstract and more fragile. This is one of the central transformations in the history of hunger. Scarcity was no longer only environmental, it was also organizational. A region might contain food and still produce thin bodies if the system that distributed or protected that food did not function smoothly. This does not mean ancient states were always badly managed or uniquely cruel. It means that scale introduces friction. The more people a system must feed, the more it depends on timing, trust, transport, and cooperation across distance. Any weakness can widen quickly. A flood in one agricultural zone may reduce supply for a city far away. Conflict along a road may interrupt trade or transport. A storage site damaged by pests or dampness may weaken the reserves of thousands rather than dozens. A modest failure in one year may become more serious if it follows another modest year, especially when large populations have already narrowed the margin for error. Human origins remain visible inside this because the same human chain of dependency still had to be sustained. Children needed growth. Workers needed strength. Mothers needed recovery. Older adults needed support. Ill or injured people needed care. A large society is not just a mass of producers. It is a vast field of unequal needs, and that makes hunger more than a question of total harvest. It becomes a question of whether the structure of society can carry food reliably from place to place and season to season without too much being lost on the way. Historical evidence from many regions supports this careful pattern. Large civilizations often built impressive systems of agriculture, irrigation, storage, and exchange. Yet they remained vulnerable to disruption, especially where climate variation, war, political instability, or local crop failure weakened the links between production and distribution. The scale of civilization, therefore, created a strange double effect. It made greater abundance possible, but it also made the consequences of interruption larger and more difficult to escape. Smaller groups could sometimes move away from trouble. Larger settled societies often had to endure it where they stood. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, this helps deepen the answer. Hunger lasted not only because nature was uncertain, but because human organization became complex enough that food could fail somewhere between the field and the mouth. The larger the civilization, the more that distance mattered, and the more easily shortage in one part of the system could become a wider human condition. The growth of civilization did not remove the old human dependence on timing. It made timing more demanding. In a small group, food could be shared quickly after it was found. In a larger society, food had to move through longer chains of labor and waiting. Fields had to be planted on time, canals or water systems maintained, harvests gathered before spoilage or damage, stores protected, roads kept passable, and supplies moved before local need became severe. A larger population could survive only if many separate actions aligned well enough for nourishment to keep flowing. This is one of the deepest reasons hunger remained common even in organized societies that look powerful from a distance. Strength at the level of buildings, walls, roads, or institutions did not automatically become security at the level of the stomach. Human origins help place this in a wider frame. Our species began in direct ecological relationships, where the body and the surrounding landscape were tightly connected. As societies expanded, that directness faded. Food still came from soil, water, plants, and animals, but now it often passed through more layers before reaching the people who depended on it. Every added layer could increase efficiency in good conditions, yet every added layer could also create delay. Delay matters because the body does not live on the idea that grain exists somewhere. It lives on food arriving in time. This is why larger civilizations could appear abundant and still leave many people vulnerable. The system as a whole might contain enough, but enough at the level of total quantity is not the same as enough in the right place, at the right moment, in usable form. This distinction is one of the oldest truths of hunger. As population density rose, local shortfalls became harder to solve through movement alone. A scattered foraging group might respond to pressure by changing territory or shifting diet. A larger farming population tied to fields, homes, storage sites and obligations often had far less freedom. It had to wait for repairs, for transport, for the next harvest, or for food to arrive from somewhere else. Waiting in such a system could become dangerous. A delay of days or weeks might not sound large in abstract terms, but for a population already living with narrow reserves it could matter greatly. Meals shrink before collapse becomes visible. Bodies weaken before a society is described as being in crisis. Hunger often enters quietly, through accumulated interruption rather than sudden catastrophe. Historical evidence from many regions supports this broader caution. Large societies repeatedly built systems to reduce uncertainty through storage, taxation, transport, irrigation, and administration. These systems often worked well enough to sustain impressive populations over long stretches of time, yet their very existence shows that food security was not simple. If it had been simple, such constant management would have been less necessary. The need for granaries, guarded routes, planned distribution, and seasonal coordination suggests that nourishment remained difficult to hold steady at scale. Human origins remain visible here because the same fragile biological realities continued underneath all civilization. Children still required regular feeding. Workers still needed energy to maintain the very systems that fed them. Illness could still reduce labor. Older adults still required care. A large society did not outgrow dependence. It multiplied dependence. That multiplication is why hunger could persist even where human organization became highly developed. Civilization enlarged the human food system, but it also enlarged the number of ways in which that system could falter. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, this helps complete the picture of growing populations and early states. Hunger survived not because civilization failed to become impressive, but because impressiveness is not the same as continuity. The human world became bigger, denser, and more coordinated, yet the body still lived one day at a time. For most of history, the systems built to feed that body remained too fragile, too uneven, or too exposed to guarantee that food would always arrive before need caught up with it. For most of human history, the environment itself rarely stayed still long enough for food systems to become fully secure. Climate has always moved in slow rhythms and sudden shifts, and those movements can change the availability of food without warning. A few seasons of unusual rain can flood fields, damage stored grain, and disrupt planting cycles. A stretch of dry years can reduce crop yields, weaken pastures, and alter the behavior of animals that people depend on. Even small changes in temperature can shift the timing of plant growth, insect activity, and water flow in ways that ripple through entire food systems. This is one reason hunger remains such a persistent presence in the human story. Food production depends not only on human effort, but also on environmental conditions that cannot be fully controlled. Human origins make this relationship especially clear. Our species evolved in landscapes where survival depended on watching the environment carefully and adjusting behavior when conditions changed. Movement, diet flexibility, and shared knowledge helped early humans respond to shifting climates and landscapes. But as societies became more settled and more dependent on farming, flexibility often narrowed. Fields cannot easily move when rainfall patterns change. Irrigation systems depend on rivers that may behave differently from one generation to the next. Crops selected for productivity may also become more sensitive to drought, frost, pests, or disease. The human body, however, still requires steady nourishment regardless of what the environment decides to do in a particular year. This tension between biological need and environmental variability has shaped the entire history of hunger. Archaeology and environmental science both suggest that many human societies lived through periods when climate patterns shifted enough to disturb established food systems. These shifts were not always catastrophic. Sometimes they were gradual, almost quiet. A region that once produced reliable harvests might begin to yield less. A river that once flooded predictably might change its timing or strength. A familiar growing season might become shorter or more uncertain. Such changes could slowly erode the balance between population and food supply. Communities might adapt for a time through new crops, altered planting schedules, trade, migration, or technological adjustments. Yet, adaptation itself requires energy, stability, and time. When several environmental pressures occur close together, the ability to adjust can weaken. This is why hunger cannot be understood simply as a failure of human knowledge or effort. It is often the result of human systems encountering environmental patterns that do not cooperate long enough for security to develop. The deeper human past reminds us that nature has always been dynamic. Forests expand and retreat, grasslands shift, rivers carve new channels, rainfall patterns wander over decades and centuries. Even modest environmental changes can matter greatly when large populations depend on narrow food foundations. Human origins remain visible here because the biological demands of our species never paused while the environment changed around us. Children still needed growth. Adults still required strength for work. The ill and elderly still required care. When climate conditions disturbed the flow of food, the human body felt the consequences quickly. This is one of the quiet lessons of environmental history. Hunger often arrives not because the earth suddenly stops producing food, but because the patterns that once supported a community's food system begin to drift away from what that system expects. Fields, irrigation works, storage structures, and trade routes are all designed around assumptions about how nature behaves. When those assumptions become unreliable, even a well-organized society can struggle to keep nourishment steady. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, environmental variability becomes an essential part of the answer. The human world has always tried to stabilize food, yet the larger natural world continues to move in ways that resist permanent stability. For most of history, that movement kept human communities living close to the edge where effort, knowledge, and cooperation were necessary just to keep hunger from growing stronger. Environmental change rarely harms a food system all at once. More often, it weakens the system by altering the timing and reliability of things that people have quietly built their lives around. A farming community may not fail because one harvest disappears completely. It may fail because planting becomes less predictable, because the rains arrive too early one year and too late the next, because the river no longer rises in a way people can trust, or because heat and dryness linger just long enough to reduce yields without announcing a full disaster. This slower kind of disturbance is one of the deepest reasons hunger remained so common in human history. It does not always look dramatic from a distance, yet it steadily narrows the margin between enough food and not enough. Human origins help explain why such narrowing matters so much. Our species developed in environments where flexibility offered protection. If one area became less productive, movement, substitution, and broad dietary knowledge could sometimes soften the blow. But settled societies built around fields, canals, herds, orchards, or seasonal planting calendars often depend on repetition. They need the environment to behave similarly enough from year to year for work, memory, and expectation to remain useful. When that repetition begins to fray, hunger can enter quietly through the gap between what people prepare for and what nature actually delivers. This is why environmental instability is not only about extremes, it is also about drift. A slightly shorter wet season, a few years of uncertain flooding, a slow decline in soil moisture, a gradual movement of grazing patterns, or a new vulnerability to pests can all weaken the food base of a population. None of these changes need to destroy a society in a single moment to matter deeply. The human body does not wait for full collapse. It responds to thinner harvests, narrower diets, and longer periods between secure meals. Communities may keep functioning while their resilience slowly declines. Children may grow under tighter conditions. Workers may labor with less reserve. Stores may run lower before the next season begins. What looks like stability on the surface may already contain the beginning of hunger underneath. The deeper human story is filled with this kind of environmental negotiation. People watched the sky, tracked water, adjusted planting dates, moved livestock, shifted crops where possible, and relied on memory passed across generations. These responses were intelligent and often effective, but they worked best when change stayed within familiar bounds. When change moved beyond those bounds, adaptation became harder. A calendar inherited from earlier conditions might no longer fit the present. Knowledge of when to sow, when to move, or when to expect local abundance could become less reliable. That is one of the most unsettling forms of scarcity. It is not only that food becomes harder to obtain, it is that the old relationship between knowledge and environment becomes less trustworthy. Human origins remain visible here because our species has always depended on learned patterns as much as on raw strength. The environment teaches through repetition, and human beings survive partly by remembering those lessons. But when the natural world shifts enough, memory can lose some of its power. A place that fed earlier generations may no longer feed the same way. A river that once signaled planting may become erratic. A herd route may move elsewhere. The result is not immediate ignorance, but weakened confidence. And weakened confidence in food systems often becomes hunger long before it becomes famine. Archaeology, climate science, and environmental history all support this careful view. Many societies endured environmental variation for long periods, yet repeated stress could still erode the balance between population, labor, and nourishment. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, environmental change deepens the answer by showing that hunger often grew not from absolute emptiness, but from the slow breakdown of predictability itself. The world that formed us was never fixed, and human food systems, however skillful, rarely had enough control to make that movement harmless for long. Environmental instability also carried another quiet consequence. It did not only change the amount of food that landscapes could provide, it changed the reliability of the knowledge people depended on to find that food. For most of human history, survival required an intimate relationship with seasonal patterns. Communities learned when rivers would rise, when plants would mature, when animals would migrate, and when soil would hold enough moisture to accept seeds. These patterns formed the living calendar of a society. They guided planting, travel, gathering, grazing, and preparation for the lean periods that every year eventually brought. Yet a calendar only works when the world behaves close enough to what memory expects. When climate begins to shift, that shared memory can slowly lose its accuracy. Human origins help illuminate why this loss matters so deeply. Our species evolved not only through physical adaptation, but also through the ability to store knowledge across generations. Elders passed on experience. Families repeated techniques that had worked before. Communities shaped their movements and labor around environmental rhythms that seemed dependable enough to guide life. This long memory was one of the great strengths of humanity, but it also meant that when the environment changed beyond familiar limits, the connection between memory and reality could weaken. A planting date that once matched the arrival of rain might begin to fail. A region known for reliable harvests might start producing uneven returns. A river whose seasonal flooding once fertilized the soil might begin arriving too early, too late, or not strongly enough to renew the land. None of these changes needed to destroy the food supply immediately. They only needed to make the future harder to anticipate. When anticipation weakens, preparation becomes less effective, and hunger often grows from that uncertainty. This form of vulnerability is difficult to see in a single year. It often appears across generations. A community may continue using inherited practices because those practices worked well for a long time. Yet as environmental conditions drift, the same practices may slowly lose their ability to protect food security. Harvests may become less consistent. Grazing patterns may shift away from known territories. Wild foods that once filled seasonal gaps may become harder to locate. The human body experiences these changes not as dramatic disaster, but as thinner margins. A successful harvest might still occur, yet it may no longer be strong enough to restore reserves completely. A familiar plant might still grow, but less abundantly than before. A hunting ground might still exist, but require longer journeys. Over time, these subtle shifts can accumulate until hunger becomes a more regular companion of everyday life. Archaeology and environmental science both support the idea that many human societies experience periods when established food systems struggled to adjust to new conditions. Some communities responded through migration, technological change, or altered farming strategies. Others adapted slowly through experimentation and new knowledge, yet adaptation always required time, labor, and cooperation. During that process, hunger often remained close because the old system was weakening, while the new one had not yet fully taken shape. Human origins remain visible even in these later stages because the basic human body had not changed. It still depended on steady nourishment regardless of how uncertain the environment became. A shifting climate could interrupt the pathways through which that nourishment normally arrived, and when those pathways faltered, the body felt the strain immediately. This is one of the deepest lessons in the environmental story of hunger. Food insecurity often emerges not from the sudden disappearance of nature's generosity, but from the slow separation between what people expect the world to do and what the world actually does. When that separation grows wide enough, even intelligent and hard-working communities can struggle to keep food flowing steadily. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, environmental instability completes the picture by reminding us that the planet itself has always been a moving system. Human societies tried to build stability within that movement, but for most of our past, the motion of climate, water, and ecosystems remained stronger than any attempt to hold nourishment perfectly steady. Hunger also persisted through history because food was never only a natural resource. It was also a social resource. Once human communities grew beyond small groups where most food was shared directly among those who gathered it, the path from field or forest to the human body began to pass through social structures. Food could be taxed, stored collectively, traded, controlled, redistributed, or reserved for particular purposes. These systems often helped communities survive difficult seasons, yet they also introduced new possibilities for uneven access. A society might produce enough food overall and still leave some people living close to shortage if the pathways that moved food through the community did not reach everyone equally. Human origins help illuminate why this transformation mattered. Early human groups relied heavily on cooperation and sharing because survival required it. A successful hunt or gathering effort was rarely kept by one person alone. The group's strength depended on maintaining bonds that allowed food to circulate quickly to those who needed it. But as societies grew larger and more complex, the simple immediacy of that sharing became harder to maintain. Food began to move through households, markets, officials, storage systems, and long-distance trade networks. Each of these layers could improve organization, yet each also placed distance between production and consumption. That distance could allow food to accumulate in some places, while scarcity appeared in others. This does not mean ancient societies were uniquely unfair or careless. It means that complex systems inevitably create variation in how resources move. A harvest gathered in one region might be directed towards cities, armies, construction projects, or storage for future emergencies. Trade might carry grain across long distances in exchange for other goods. Some households might hold larger reserves because of land ownership, political influence, or successful labor. Meanwhile, other households might depend on wages, seasonal work, or uncertain access to local markets. The human body experiences these differences very directly. One group may eat regularly while another struggles to secure enough for daily nourishment, even though both live inside the same society. Archaeology and historical records from many regions suggest that hunger often appeared within otherwise productive landscapes. Fields could be fertile, storage systems could exist, markets could operate. Yet not every person within those systems had equal protection from lean periods. Crop failures, price changes, taxation demands, or disruptions in trade could quickly expose those who lived closest to the margin. Hunger, therefore, became not only a question of environmental conditions or agricultural success, but also of social position within the structures that moved food. Human origins remain visible even in this later development because the biological demands of our species never changed. Every human body still needed regular nourishment, regardless of its place in the social order. Children required growth, workers required strength, and the ill or elderly required care. When food flowed unevenly through a society, the effects appeared first among those whose access was already uncertain. This pattern helps explain why hunger could exist, even during periods when civilizations seemed stable or prosperous. Total food production may have been sufficient in a broad sense, yet the pathways through which food traveled were shaped by priorities, obligations, and social arrangements that did not always place equal weight on every life. For most of history, the human food system therefore carried two kinds of uncertainty at once. Nature could disrupt supply through drought, flood, pests, or shifting climate. Society could shape distribution through ownership, storage, taxation, trade, and local power. Both forces acted together to determine whether nourishment reached the body in time. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, this social dimension becomes essential. Hunger endured not only because food was difficult to produce or preserve, but also because the structures that organized human life did not always deliver that food evenly to everyone who depended on it. As food systems became more organized, hunger could persist even without total scarcity, because access and abundance were no longer the same thing. This is one of the most important social truths in the history of hunger. A society may contain fields, granaries, trade routes, herds, fishing grounds, and productive labor, yet still leave many people uncertain about their next meal if those resources do not move toward them in a stable way. The problem is not simply how much food exists in the landscape, it is who can reach it, who controls it, who stores it, and who must wait for it to be released. Human origins help us understand why this shift mattered so deeply. In smaller groups closer to the beginning of the human story, the distance between obtaining food and sharing it was often short. A gathered food or a successful hunt entered the life of the group directly. But as villages, towns, and more complex societies developed, food increasingly moved through systems of obligation. Grain could belong to a landowner, a temple, a ruling household, a local authority, or a market before it became a meal for an ordinary person. This did not automatically make life worse. Organized systems could support larger populations and create reserves that smaller groups could never maintain. Yet they also meant that a person's access to nourishment depended not only on nature and labor, but on position within society. This is where hunger became more layered. A field could yield enough, but a worker without secure claim to that food might still live close to shortage. A harvest could be stored, yet those stores might be rationed, sold, taxed, or reserved. A market could be full, yet prices could rise beyond what many households could manage. Food could physically exist and still remain socially distant from the body that needed it. The body, of course, does not care whether food is absent because the rain failed or because the grain is behind a wall, in another district, or in the hands of someone else. It only feels continuity or the lack of it. This helps explain why hunger remained common in societies that were not empty of food. Historical evidence from many places suggests that lean living often existed beside organized production because access was uneven, unstable, or conditional. Some people had land, animals, reserves, and social protection. Others depended on day labor, seasonal success, debt, exchange, or the goodwill of institutions. Those differences mattered greatly when harvests were only modest, when storage was lower than expected, or when conflict and disruption narrowed the available supply. Human origins remain visible here because the same biological chain of need still continued underneath every social layer. Children needed steady nourishment, regardless of ownership patterns. Workers needed energy regardless of taxation schedules. Pregnant women, older adults, and the sick remained vulnerable regardless of what the wider economy looked like. This means social inequality in food systems was not an abstract issue. It entered the body directly as thinner meals, less dietary variety, weaker recovery, and a greater risk that a difficult season would become a dangerous one. Hunger, therefore, persisted not only because production could fail, but because human systems often distributed risk unequally. People closest to power, storage, land, or trade usually stood farther from immediate shortage than those living on the edge of the system. This is one reason prosperity in the broad sense should never be mistaken for nutritional security in the intimate sense. A civilization may look strong from the outside, while many of its people remain close to hunger inside it. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, the social answer becomes clearer here. Hunger survived because food was increasingly embedded in systems of control, exchange, and unequal access. Nature shaped the supply, but society shaped who felt the shortage first. And for most of history, many human beings lived in positions where even a functioning food system could still leave them only a short distance from want. The social side of hunger becomes clearest when we notice how often food could be present within a society and still fail to become security for ordinary lives. This is one of the great historical ironies. A landscape may produce grain, a town may contain storage, a market may operate, and a ruling system may appear stable, yet many people can remain only a short distance from hunger if their claim to food is weak. In that sense, the history of hunger is not only the history of shortage, it is also the history of fragile entitlement, fragile access, and fragile trust that tomorrow's food will still belong to the person who needs it. Human origins help place this in a wider perspective. Near the beginning of our story, food insecurity was tied closely to ecology, season, mobility, and the limits of small groups. As societies grew more complex, those older pressures remained, but they became joined by another layer. Food moved through institutions. It became part of systems of rent, tribute, tax, wages, markets, inheritance, landholding, and stored reserve. These systems could protect communities in some circumstances, yet they could also create distance between labor and nourishment. A person could work on land without controlling the food that came from it. A household could help bring in a harvest and still depend on what remained after obligations were met. A worker could live near abundance in a city while relying on prices, wages, or distributions that shifted beyond personal control. The body experiences this social distance just as seriously as it experiences environmental scarcity. It does not know whether the missed meal comes from drought, transport failure, debt, or unequal ownership. It only knows the narrowing of intake and the uncertainty of the next day. This is why hunger lasted so long in civilizations that were clearly capable of producing and storing large amounts of food. Capability at the level of society does not automatically become security at the level of the individual household. The path from field to stomach can still be interrupted by obligation, hierarchy, delay, or exclusion. Historical evidence from many regions suggests exactly this broad pattern. There were periods when food systems functioned well enough to sustain large populations, yet many ordinary people remained vulnerable because their access depended on conditions they did not fully control. A modest rise in prices, a smaller harvest than expected, a local disruption in trade, a demand for tax or rent, or the loss of wages could push households with little reserve into immediate difficulty. This helps explain why hunger often appeared first not where there was no food at all, but where food security was socially thin. Human origins remain visible even at this stage because the human chain of dependency still had to be maintained under these unequal conditions. Children still needed regular nourishment. Caregivers still had to divide food among bodies with different needs. Older adults and the sick still depended on others. A family living near the margin could not easily absorb disturbance, whether the disturbance came from nature or from the social system itself. In that sense, social complexity did not replace the older ecological problem. It layered new vulnerability on top of it. Nature could still reduce production, and society could still distribute the reduction unevenly. That double pressure made hunger remarkably persistent. It also shaped the moral reality of human history. Hunger was never only a sign that the earth had failed. Very often, it was also a sign that the human pathways carrying food were selective, delayed, or fragile. When we ask why humans were hungry for most of history, this final social angle completes a difficult truth. People were often hungry not only because food was hard to find, grow, or preserve, but because belonging to a food-producing world was never the same as being securely fed within it. The human story is full of fields, granaries, markets, and labor. Yet for long stretches of time, many lives remained one disruption away from shortage. Hunger endured because food had become part of society, and society, like nature, was never steady enough to guarantee equal continuity for everyone. Only very recently, in the long scale of human existence, have some societies begun to experience something close to continuous food availability. This change is so familiar to modern life that it can feel normal, yet measured against the deeper human past it is highly unusual. Shops remain full across seasons. Food travels across oceans. Harvest failure in one region can sometimes be softened by imports from another. Preservation methods have grown far more reliable. Storage is larger, transport is faster, and calories can often be obtained without direct knowledge of weather, soil, migration, or local ecology. For many people, the ancient distance between body and food has become shorter than at any earlier point in history. Yet this modern condition should be understood carefully. It does not mean hunger has vanished from the world, and it does not mean the human body has been reshaped to match this new abundance. It means that in some parts of the world, for a relatively brief historical moment, human food systems have become more stable than the biological history that formed us. Human origins make this contrast especially important. Our species emerged in environments where nourishment was uncertain, seasonal, and effortful. The body learned to value dense calories, to store some surplus, and to endure interruptions because interruptions were common. Now, in modern food environments, many of those same biological tendencies meet a world of constant availability. Sweetness is no longer rare, fat is no longer occasional, starchy energy no longer requires long labor to reach the mouth. This does not create a simple moral lesson, and it should not be turned into a crude story that the modern world is unnatural in every respect. Human beings are cultural creatures as well as biological ones. We change our environments, and that has always been part of our history. Still, the larger contrast remains striking. For most of history, the challenge was how to survive despite irregular access to food. In many modern settings, the challenge has become how to live wisely within systems that can provide more food, more often, than the old human body was ever required to navigate. This historical reversal helps explain why the title matters beyond the past. To say that humans were hungry for most of history is not only to describe ancient hardship, it is also to recognize that our bodies, appetites, preferences, and food cultures were shaped in a very different world from the one many people now inhabit. The memory of scarcity is still present in the body even when the immediate environment has changed. That memory appears in cravings, in storage, in the emotional weight of food, and in the deep social meanings humans continue to attach to feeding one another. It also appears in the fact that food remains one of the most sensitive links between environment, society, and the body. Even modern systems, impressive as they are, depend on fragile chains of production, transport, energy, labor, and stability. The old problem has been reduced in some places, but not erased from the human condition. This is why the long history of hunger should be approached not with superiority toward the past, but with humility. The modern world did not abolish the human dependence on nourishment. It only built more elaborate ways of protecting that dependence from the instability that shaped earlier ages. When we look back across the long arc of human life, hunger appears not as an odd exception, but as one of the oldest teachers of our species. It shaped movement, memory, sharing, patience, metabolism, and social organization. And now, in a world where some people can live for years without feeling the old uncertainty directly, the deeper question becomes quieter and perhaps more important. If so much of what we are was formed under scarcity, what kind of human future are we now creating inside abundance? The long history of hunger has shaped not only the body, but also the habits of thought that surround food. For most of human existence, nourishment carried emotional and social meaning far beyond simple survival. Food was reassurance that a difficult day had ended safely. It was proof that cooperation had worked. It was the quiet relief of seeing children eat and knowing the group had made it through another uncertain moment. When scarcity lives close to everyday life, food becomes more than energy. It becomes memory, care, responsibility, and trust. This deeper meaning did not disappear as food systems became more stable in some parts of the world. Instead, it remained inside culture, language, and human behavior. Human origins help illuminate why this connection is so persistent. Early humans depended on shared effort to secure nourishment. A successful hunt, a patch of gathered plants, or a season that produced enough food was rarely experienced alone. It was felt across the group. The ability to feed others became a sign of belonging and responsibility. The act of sharing food helped maintain relationships that made survival possible. Over thousands of generations, these patterns shaped human expectations. Feeding others became a form of care. Being fed became a sign of protection. The presence of food often marked safety, while its absence signaled vulnerability. Even today, these older patterns still appear in quiet ways. Meals are shared during moments of celebration and grief. Guests are welcomed with food. Families express care by preparing meals for one another. Communities gather around harvest festivals, religious meals, or communal kitchens. These traditions may look purely cultural, yet beneath them lives a biological and historical memory. For most of the human past, feeding someone was not only a gesture of kindness, it was a meaningful contribution to their survival. Hunger, therefore, shaped not only metabolism but also human relationships. It taught cooperation because isolation was dangerous. It encouraged patience because food did not always arrive quickly. It strengthened memory because knowing when and where nourishment might appear could protect future generations. These lessons helped build the social intelligence that allowed humans to live in increasingly complex communities. Yet this history also leaves a quiet tension in the modern world. When food becomes continuously available, the deep emotional structures formed during scarcity do not vanish overnight. The body may still seek energy as if shortage could return. The mind may still attach comfort or security to eating, even when the environment has changed. Cultural traditions around food may continue long after the original pressures that shaped them have faded. This does not mean modern habits are simply mistakes. It means that human behavior often carries echoes of earlier environments. Our species learned to survive by remembering scarcity, and that memory continues to influence how people think, feel, and act around nourishment. Human origins remain visible here because the relationship between food and identity has always been strong. Food connects the body to the environment, but it also connects individuals to families, traditions, and communities. When we consider the long history in which hunger was common, it becomes easier to understand why food still occupies such a powerful place in human life. The modern world may have altered the physical availability of nourishment in many regions, yet the psychological and cultural meaning of food continues to reflect a past where every meal carried weight. This is one of the quiet legacies of hunger. Even when scarcity fades, the behaviors shaped by it often remain. They appear in rituals of hospitality, in the comfort people find in shared meals, and in the deep human instinct to care for others by making sure they are fed. When we look across the long human story, these patterns remind us that hunger did more than challenge survival. It helped shape the emotional architecture of human society itself. The long human story returns in the end to a simple and quiet truth. For most of our existence, life unfolded close to the edge where nourishment had to be found again and again. Hunger was not always dramatic. It often appeared as waiting, as uncertainty, as smaller meals, as careful sharing so that tomorrow might still arrive with enough strength to continue. Generation after generation learned to live within that fragile rhythm. They moved across landscapes, planted fields, built storage, developed cooperation, and passed knowledge forward, all in an effort to keep food flowing steadily enough for the human body to endure. The remarkable thing is not that hunger existed. The remarkable thing is that human societies continued to survive, adapt, and expand despite it. Human origins remain present in that persistence. Our species was shaped by environments where nourishment could never be assumed. Patience became part of survival. Cooperation became necessary. Memory became valuable. People learned to observe the land, the sky, the movement of animals, and the cycles of water and plants. Food was never guaranteed, yet human communities built ways of living that could carry them through uncertainty often enough to continue the story. The deeper history of hunger therefore reveals something important about the character of our species. Humans did not emerge from a world of constant abundance. They emerged from a world where nourishment required attention, restraint, and shared effort. Even agriculture, storage, trade, and the rise of civilization did not erase this challenge. They only changed the methods through which people negotiated with it. Across tens of thousands of years, hunger remained near because nature remained dynamic. Societies remained imperfect, and the human body required continuity that the world rarely delivered easily. Yet this same long struggle also shaped some of the strongest features of human life: the need to feed one another, strengthened cooperation, the uncertainty of seasons encouraged foresight. The memory of lean times encouraged sharing, storage, and planning. Hunger, difficult as it was, became one of the pressures that guided the development of human intelligence, culture, and community. Without it, the human story might have unfolded very differently. In the modern world, many people now live in environments where food appears constantly available. Fields may be distant. The work of planting and harvest may be invisible. Markets remain full across seasons. The ancient uncertainty that shaped our species can fade into the background of daily life. Yet the deeper history remains part of who we are. The body still carries the biology formed under scarcity. Human cultures still carry traditions shaped by the effort to feed families and communities. And the global food system, impressive though it is, still depends on fragile chains of climate, soil, water, labor, transport, and cooperation. Remembering the long age of hunger is therefore not an exercise in sadness. It is a reminder of how recent and how delicate food security truly is. It also invites a quieter kind of reflection. The past shows that the human body, mind, and society were built in partnership with uncertainty. Abundance, when it appears, becomes something that must be cared for wisely rather than taken for granted. When we step back and look across the entire arc of human existence, one thought remains gently unresolved. If our species was shaped for hundreds of thousands of years by the challenge of living beside hunger, what kind of human future will grow from a world where that challenge, at least in some places, is beginning to fade?